Welcome to this audio commentary featuring the production and post-production teams. I'm Barry Osborne, producer of Lord of the Rings, and I'll be joined on this commentary by the various people who helped bring this film together on the set and in the cutting rooms, cutting picture, sound effects, and music, and those responsible for the visual effects. Together, all of us helped to bring the Fellowship of the Ring to the screen, and over the next 3.5 hours, we'll share some of the stories of that experience with you.
The actual Lord of the Rings logo was thrown together in the last week before all the effects shots were locked.
So essentially what happened was we were working with another title company and we were running out of time. Peter was scoring in London and then just coming back, and we just found ourselves cutting it down to the wire. So Pete decided that we should just have our own little internal design team quickly put something together. And Alan Lee came in, and Sasha Lees, who's over at Weta Physical.
Workshop.
She is a graphic artist, and she came up with the Wingnut Films new line and the end cards.
There's a theme that's used in the very beginning of the film that has to do with the history of the ring, because in the prologue is explaining how the ring was forged and all the historical references to the ring. And there's a theme that's used there that's actually a Gondorian theme that you hear as the Fellowship goes through the gates of the Argonath and then into Amon Hand, and you see runed statuary of Gondor, and you hear that theme there.
We went through a number of different iterations of how the movie would start, and originally there was a prologue in the film, and then there was a decision that maybe the prologue was a slow way to get into the movie, and we didn't need it, and we'd get into the movie with Gandalf arriving at Bag End, and then we thought, well, we'd add Bilbo riding in the den talking about hobbits and starting his book before his journey, which was quite a nice scene, and it was a shame to lose. But we went back to the idea that we should set the story up and that you needed to know the history of Middle-earth, and that a great way to get into the history of Middle-earth was through this prologue.
One ring to rule them.
Early on in the process, Peter recognized that one of the challenges to bringing Lord of the Rings to the screen was to create these massive battles. And that meant being able to throw an army of 40,000 people on the screen. He spent his own money doing research and development in a program that would accomplish that in a very sophisticated fashion. Because it was create these massive armies, he nicknamed it Massive Software. Each being on the screen is capable of selecting from a range of actions and reactions. So if they're in battle, and someone comes at them and raises a sword, they can raise a shield, they can parry the sword with another sword blow. They know if they get hit 3 times, they're dead, so they fall over and die. So there's this intelligent brain built into each one of those 10,000 people on screen or 40,000 people on screen. It's quite remarkable.
No, I remember going on a Saturday into Weta Workshop, and there was a lump of clay sitting on a table in a pencil cam, and that was basically Peter. Before Peter went off to London to score, he took the pencil cam and kind of stuck it at some lumps of clay and said, "This is the battlefield that I want to portray." And so we then took that pencil cam clay model and translated it into the computer. So all these battlefield shots are completely computer generated. Again, in these 2 months, other than the blue screen elements, which are a lot of the foreground.
And a few live action shots that the lump of clay had to match.
Right, yeah, exactly.
A totally synthetic environment created, from scratch in a very short amount of time.
Massive armies, 70,000 armies.
Comps and matte paintings, and, it's just, it was an amazing effort and an amazing job, given the time.
But it had that Kiwi can-do attitude.
It did.
And we're just getting this taste of Massive in film 1. It gets more prevalent in film 2, and in film 3, it's all out war with these guys.
The sounds for the moment when Sauron explodes, one was metal compression tension sounds that we recorded with some big ships rocking and rolling in the harbor, and from inside where you get the sounds of the walls of the ship just moving against each other. And one of the other components was the sound of old World War II airplanes passing by ships, and their propeller sounds reflect off of metal walls.
Peter wanted the sound of all the joints straining and rivets starting to pop and everything happening.
This scene we took out of the original cut because when you see him put the ring on here, we'd seen Sauron wearing the ring and he didn't disappear at all. So when Isildur puts on the ring, we thought, uh-oh, we've got a lot of information going down here. Putting on the ring and disappearing It's just an added complication, an already very busy part of the show. We wanted to make sure that the plot points were communicated really well, and it was a complication we just didn't think that the audience could cope with at that point, so we lifted it. Putting it back in, Peter always liked it, and to him the logic of putting the ring on, disappearing, the ring betraying him and disappearing into the water was a story point he always really liked. Even though it was complicating things at that point, he did always really like it, so it was logical to put it back into the extended cut.
This prologue was actually the last thing, really, that got locked editorially. I mean, even when we were in London scoring the movie, this was still being tinkered with. Did you want to end it with a sense of Bilbo and the hobbits and the things to come, or did you want to stress it on the looming evil of the ring?
Pete added this Gollum shot at the last moment, too, and we wanted to get something that was evocative and told the story of Gollum in one image.
Basically, we went over the miniature stage, picked some rocks out, shoved them on the C-stands, kind of composed this cave, and I think within a week, Alex had this whole interior shot.
We had to do that at the very end of production in order to make up some continuity. So we built this set full size. We just took all of our old miniature pieces and put them together to pretend to be full-size rocks. Those beams are real, the rippling water is real, and the only thing that's actually in effect here is Gollum himself, an animated Gollum up there sitting on the rock.
I storyboarded this basically over a phone call with Peter. We were having a conference call and went to digital, and he was describing a kind of shot. And yeah, we boarded it and basically almost had the miniature shot and the animation blocked out and everything while he was actually in the UK. I think it was almost that.
Yeah,
Sending
it was
him
when he was
emails and
scoring, I think,
storyboards, So
yeah.
it was all almost constructed with him in another country.
But I think that's something that we were really blessed by, was that Christian and Pete had boarded a lot on previous movies, and then just because of our long design phase on this film and the fact that we're doing 3 films at once, it enabled a lot of us to kind of get into the same headspace so that Peter could, rely on someone like Christian, just by doing it over the phone.
The concept of having young Ian Holm or young Bilbo was in and out of the script several times.
Yeah.
And it was in very early, and then it was out for a while, and it was in for a while. Its placement in the story was moved around depending on whether we had a prologue or didn't have a prologue.
This map shot we had redone for the DVD just so that we could make a transition out of those mountains to bring us to Hobbiton. A little earlier on, this was how the movie started, on a map which pulled out into Bilbo's study, and we started the movie in Hobbiton. This was a version of the movie we had where there was no prologue. So the prologue was put on the front, we lifted this section out, and the map you're seeing now was re-engineered to get us from the mountains into Bilbo's study, which is just coming up.
The thing about Hobbiton for me was that when a crew kind of moves in on location to a small town kind of area, obviously everybody within 100 miles is aware of your presence there. And we wanted to make sure that we did our best at not just recreating Hobbiton, but also ensuring that the people didn't get any glimpses of it before actually seeing it on the screen. The farmers were really helpful in terms of giving us warnings of people wandering around with cameras or whatnot, so we could go meet with them, or warning us when a plane or a chopper was going to be coming our way. I think a few pictures, aerial photos were taken, but for the most part we were able to keep it relatively intact and away from the public until we actually got on the screen.
We wanted the audience to feel like it was a really inviting place and it was warm. Everyone basically had a good sense of humour and it was a loving community. So what the actual photographic approach was that I still wanted to sort of keep the greens and the qualities that were in that landscape, but what we tended to do was I really just photographically and with the digital timing that we did later, we really just enhanced the yellows in the landscape so that the greens took on a bit more of a glow. I mean, the art department basically spent 12 months growing the location. It was a location that I say was grown more than built. And the actual building was, I suspect, a small part of, it was more bulldozing, it was more landscape design than building.
The Shire theme was written actually quite early. I mean, even after the visit to New Zealand the first time. And I think it was based more on the beauty of New Zealand, because Hobbiton is so inherently I just had a feeling of New Zealand, of it, that rural beauty to it. And I wrote the Shire theme pretty early on, and then related the Shire theme to Frodo. The Shire theme is probably the most innocent theme in the film. I wanted it to have a somewhat of a feeling of to have a rural feeling. I wanted to have enough malleability to be able to create a heroic feeling to it. And as Frodo takes the ring and he's on his journey, that this theme would carry with him through the story. And in the beginning, in the Shire, you hear a much more sort of frolicking version of it. As film one progresses and ends, you hear the Shire theme transformed into what I call the hymn, which is a version of the Shire theme. It has more of a center core to it, and it's slower.
The thing, again, that everybody talks about is how did you get these guys to be, so small?
So much is Roto and so much is blues. It's everything at once.
So the key to making these hobbits appear small, as it is in any film, is to use numerous different techniques, which is forced perspective and blue screen and just guys with big suits that look bigger than the hobbits. And what it does is it keeps... You never really focus on one type of effect. You're always kind of looking, shooting over a double, seeing Bilbo and just sticking him on the apple crates. And it's that kind of shell game that you play with the different types of effects that I think makes it flawless. You're not always looking at it and saying, oh, here's a blue screen digital double, a blue screen double. It's just.
Yeah, a lot of that was figured out too on a wild afternoon with Peter and Rick Porras and myself and Charlie McClellan playing Gandalf with a great big head on a stick, and we were just running around doing a very wild amateur theatrical version of what wound up in the movie. I wanted to play Gandalf myself, but I wound up playing Sam, a la Daffy Duck, I'm afraid. It's humiliating, and I hope they put the tape on a bar magnet, but unfortunately I think it survives. So just think kindly of us when you watch it, please.
We took this section out for the movie because we didn't really want to see Bilbo so clearly. We wanted to wait and reveal him when Gandalf meets him at Bag End, at the door of Bag End. Also, we were worried that it made him into a bit of an evil character, and we wanted to see the happy Bilbo first.
This sequence with Bilbo writing in his book in Bag End and describing the nature of hobbits was in a cut of the movie, but when the final decision was made to start the movie with a prologue, there was a feeling at the studio that perhaps to go from a prologue to Bilbo essentially narrating, the nature of hobbits in a book might be redundant in terms of an audience perception, that you were going from sort of, a prologue to a sort of a hobbit prologue, and that those two things bumping up against each other might get the movie off to an awkward start. And so ultimately, it was, that note was given to Peter, and although he loved a lot of that stuff with Bilbo and Ian Holm, he ultimately agreed that for purposes of the theatrical version, that perhaps it was best to just go from the prologue right into Frodo under the tree.
My memory is different. My memory is originally the movie was conceived to start with a prologue. We thought that we should set up the ring, the history of the ring, that you needed as an audience to understand some of what this history was, what was at stake, why it was so important to destroy the ring. You needed to know the background of Sauron. You needed to understand what had happened. Then along the line, somewhere along the lines where we would probably showed the film to the studio, we started to think maybe the prologue wasn't such a great idea, and maybe we should find another way to come into the story. I actually myself was always a fan of just discovering Bag End and discovering the story with Gandalf and Frodo, and riding in, seeing these two old friends, Bilbo and Gandalf, meet. And I kind of favored and pushed for that. Pete decided you needed, if we gave up the original prologue, which is what sort of is in the movie now, that you needed an introduction, and the introduction, a great way for that introduction to be told was through Ian Holm talking about his life experience and starting out writing the book, which is actually a great idea. And we brought Ian Holm back and we filmed that sequence of him writing the book that you see here, and it became the new prologue. And then we went back to the thought that, no, you really needed to explain the prehistory of Middle-earth to know that we were now in a new age. And by the end of all three movies, we were going to enter into the Age of Man. And he wanted to show that history, and he was right to do so. So combining these two prologues was a challenge.
Gandalf entering Bag End, this was actually Big Bag End that was in the studio, and the view outside the doorway was actually put in later from a set of tiles that we had shot on location, assembled together, and then tracked in. Ian McKellen is shot separately against a blue screen. The basic process was first rehearsing several times with both of them so that they got eye lines and they could actually get the character, the performance, and dealing with each other correctly. And then having Gandalf step out, Ian McKellen, and having Ian Holm remain in the set and pantomime his entire performance. Shot it several times. Pete selected the take that he liked the most with the best camera move and the best performance of Bilbo. And then later, that move was scaled down and shot blue screen with Gandalf. And then a lot of cleanup in post-production to get hands touching hands and hats exchanging and everything else.
The month we did with Ian and Ian in Bag End was fantastic. It was, we'd do block throughs, and it was Peter and the two actors, and I think Caro and Victoria Sullivan, the script supervisor, and myself. And, they'd run through a scene, and it was not only incredibly entertaining, you felt like you're watching two of the finest actors in the world sitting in the front row of some small theatre. And you're getting the benefit of the live performance. And they work it out with Pete, and then they've decided what they want to do, and I'm sitting in there obviously because I'm supposed to be looking at things and seeing whether certain angles might work, or offer up sort of coverage suggestions, and whether we just want to bring it down this way a bit because the lighting will be sort of better for this part or that part or whatever. And sometimes I was just enjoying it so much that the actual prospect, when everyone turned in my direction, like, okay, what do you think? It was sort of like, it was almost a bit disappointing that we now had to break the scene apart and technically achieve it, because it had actually been just such a joy to sit there and watch it.
So coming up is one of the first force perspective slave motion control base moves that we did. It's shot in Big Bag End so that Bilbo looks the correct size to all his environment that he's walking around in the background. But in the foreground, Ian McKellen, playing Gandalf, is sitting at a small table on a little motion control mover that keeps his table in line with the larger table that's a few feet behind him further back. It's the larger table in the background that Bilbo is pouring tea and interacting with, and the smaller one in the foreground is what Ian McKellen's doing. So in terms of like the teapot here, he's actually setting his small prop lid right in front of him on a little rod that from camera looks like it's lined up and sitting on the larger pot that Bilbo is pouring tea into in the background.
I think it is hard. Force perspective's been done for years, of course, but this is the first time I think it's been done where they did moving force perspective. It's usually a lockdown camera on a nodal head, and now you've got one Ian closer to the camera with a table piece that is closer to the camera, and then the other Ian farther away with a bigger table piece. They line up, except when the Ian in the foreground gently bumps the table with his knee. You can see the two magically. Yes, yes.
It's at the beginning of the shot where Ian's turning in to stick his legs under the table, and if you watch the first foreground half of the table, you'll see it move in relation to the back half, which is what 5 to 10 feet away, sort of in the background there.
Right, but you didn't hear that from us.
Right.
Such an amazing location, and they put so much work into it, and the farmers just removed everything. He could have easily had his own little Hobbiton theme park, We had to go out there at least a year later in order to shoot the party tree for the big tilt down at night when the fireworks go off and you tilt down the party tree to the party that's happening. And the The party at the base was actually in the studio. This opening shot of the party was originally shot out on location, out in Hobbiton, but then it was decided to reshoot it in the studio. So they only had the lower half from about where the banner that says "Happy Birthday Bilbo Baggins" down to the ground is at. That was interior on set. So the actual tilt down the tree, we had to take the move data that they had tilting down onto the studio and take that back out to Hobbiton long after the whole Hobbiton village had been wrapped out, and repeat that move by shooting the tree and then later composite it all together.
What we wanted to do was just make it slightly offbeat as a traditional night scene. So what we tended to do was, in some of the blues, we just injected a slight amount of purple into some of the blues so that it was, it just had a bit of a quirky quality to it.
Plan 9, it's a co-op of musicians in New Zealand, wonderful musicians who live in Wellington and write music, and they had worked with Peter on other films that Peter had done. They wrote the party music. When you're shooting a film, sometimes you need music to shoot to. Like if you're shooting the party scene in Hobbiton, you needed that music to play on the set so that actors could dance and people could move to the rhythm of it. And this is well before I was involved in the film, but Plan 9 wrote a piece that they shot to. And then as we were watching the film, it was just such a wonderful piece that we just left it in.
As I recall, Billy Boyd was actually playing in the band. Pippin was playing in the band in these scenes for some of it. And I think you'd have to look pretty closely, but you can actually see some of the earlier scenes.
So here's the other half of the Sackville Baggins' equation. This is a pretty cute scene of Ian Holm wiggling his ears and the Sackville Baggins is pursuing him. Again, we just felt it was an unnecessary complication. This scene here between Bilbo and Frodo was much more difficult to lose, mainly for time. We thought, how much do you need to know about Bilbo trying to tell Frodo what he's going to do? How much does Frodo know anyway? So we decided just to wait till Bilbo disappears to have that little moment between them there. It's essentially the same moment when Bilbo says goodbye to him.
Yes, I am.
This was a tough scene to pull out of the theatrical version because it is the only scene with Bilbo and Frodo together, apart from Rivendell, which is, of course, much, much later.
And of course, all the hobbits, all these scenes they're in, they almost always had prosthetic feet with hair on. And for at least 4/5 of the shoot, I'd say they were walking around with prosthetic feet on, often whether we saw the feet or not.
Because the feet took, I guess, an hour to an hour and a half to apply every morning, apparently there was always a sense of negotiation, because to not have to wear the feet, of course, would mean an hour and a half more sleep before shooting started.
And almost without fail, by the end of the day, they would come to me and tell me, you know, that we didn't have to have our feet on today. They never shot them on camera.
See, so the thing we had to do here was that he's going to fly over here, that he has to hit the tent and set it on fire, so you have to have an interaction with the tent. They did it in the live action, but it didn't ever quite work. So basically, we just shot the tent as a blue screen element and dropped it in.
Yeah, this whole fireworks sequence, again, a very, technically a very simple set of techniques where you use particle systems, and Randy and his group animated the actual dragon animation as it was unfurling.
And most of this stuff was shot a lot of it was shot in a set.
Yeah.
In interior warehouse with all this black sky replacing just the roof of the place.
Right, so we ended up, replacing that whole sky and some of those trees and obviously adding the fireworks dragon and the smoke elements.
So the showy stuff is obviously effects, but there's a lot of stuff that's hidden, like just the background behind Ian and Elijah, which is every bit as much an effects challenge.
Mm-hmm.
The dragon had to be animated to look like a firework, and so we had to keep going back and making it less naturalistic. Mary Victoria and Doug Shepik animated it, and they animated it very well, like a creature, but it didn't look like a firework, so we had to make the animation more and more basic
It has to have that stagey, fire 1, fire 2, fire 3
exactly,
sort of thing
exactly.
to make it appear. Yeah.
As well as I should like, and I like less than half of the half as well as you deserve.
What's great about this is that no one ever actually questions that the ring makes, wears, other than Sauron, invisible, but no one ever asked why, it doesn't make Sauron invisible. And that goes back to Tolkien's writing the book, because when he wrote The Hobbit, it was really a children's story, and the conceit of the ring turning people invisible was unique to that book. But of course, once he had to write the sequel, he was stuck with the conceit and had to find some way to weave it in, even though it has no bearing on Sauron directly as well. It was always another big studio fear that non-fans would be completely distracted by the idea that why is the ring turned some people invisible but not Sauron himself. And people got so caught up in the world of the movie that they bought right into the logic without ever a single question about it.
The amazing thing about these shots here is that Ian Holm never actually visited Matamata, where the whole Hobbiton exterior set was. All his stuff was blue screen or the interior Bag End set, or the second they made like the exterior of Bag End in a soundstage as well here in Wellington, and he was there for those shots, but he never actually went up and visited. Well, he may have visited there, I don't know, but he never actually filmed anything there.
For the production, we actually built 2 different Bag Ends. They were actually exact replicas of each other, but they were 2 different sizes. What we usually referred to as Big Bag End was one in which if Ian Holm or Elijah Wood was walking around in it, he would appear his normal Hobbit size in his Hobbit environment. The smaller one was scaled down to the correct scale so that if Ian McKellen, playing Gandalf, was walking around in it, he appeared very huge. So throughout the production, Pete was able to select which shot to do and where, so that he could, get a lot of practical footage of the actors really bumping their heads, really being in that confined space and environment. And where you see both characters at once in the same room, it's usually 2-pass blue screen motion control work happening. And depending on which set you shot in would really depend upon who is spending the most time interacting with that environment. If you see Bilbo taking a lot of books off the shelves and moving around and doing a lot of stuff, it's probably usually shot in Big Bag End with Bilbo in his environment, and then shooting Gandalf separately against blue screen. But if Gandalf was interacting more with his environment, then we shoot that in the small one, and then vice versa. But the small Bag End is going to make some really amazing kids' hobby house someday. I'm sure Pete will have them both side by side, dug into some bank someday.
He's had the ring now for a while, and he's being a bit torn to leave it. And a bit of Gollum comes up in him, a bit of evil comes up, and you hear a little bit of that Gollum theme that you've heard in the beginning when you've seen Gollum. That Gollum piece is so central to the story, even before they leave to go. As Gandalf sits with Frodo in the kitchen and actually tries, explains to him the history of the ring, like what he actually has and what Bilbo has left him. Of course he talks about Gollum and this creature and what happened to him. And again, you hear little elements of the Gollum theme, and it's a very sort of mysterious piece of music, and you know the character will develop, and you just see little glimmers of Gollum through the story. So that's a very essential bit of music through all of film 1, even for a character that you really hardly see in the film. And of course, leading us to film 2, where you see, you have quite a bit of Gollum, very important character in film 2. So that's, I think, what I was saying earlier about the structure of this long piece is that you had to create Gollum and his sound and his theme very early on, even though you really don't see too much of Gollum in film 1.
These are some nice, just simple, very practical effects of just a little extra friction on the hand and then an oversized lead ring hitting the floor so it doesn't bounce, so it gets that really nice dramatic thud.
Well, when you're doing a scene like this where you have an actor acting against blue screen, another actor acting in the set, or the 2 actors working in different scale sets, they're both there for both times. And the way you capture the emotion of the scene is really paying attention to the video playback that you'd previously recorded and the interaction the actors bring to it on the set that day. And often, even though you might be only photographing, say, Gandalf, you might have a small scale double for Ian Holm so that Gandalf's eye line would be right. And you'd have Ian Holm there also directing the scale double the way he wanted him to move, getting him to give the performance that Ian gave on camera. even though this is all off camera and it's only for the benefit of the actor that's actually appearing on camera.
The ring in the script is very much a character. I mean, it has a force and a presence and an energy. And in the script and in some of the big ring moments, it's described as sort of a humming that takes over the track. And then very early on, Peter started talking about the ring actually having a character, and that turned into the ring having an actual voice that would speak to people.
One of the challenges of bringing this movie to the screen is the fact that everything you see there is manufactured. It's not available. You can't go to a prop house and get items from Middle-earth. So every piece of furniture, every fixture, all the hardware, all the costumes, all the wigs, all of that was manufactured specifically for Lord of the Rings. Incredible undertaking, and that's one of the reasons why our crew numbered over 2,000 strong.
Elijah Wood had heard about the project from his agent at William Morris and knew that Peter and Fran were really casting for really British boys. That's what they wanted. They wanted the four hobbits to be played by Brits, and he knew if he wanted to be in the running that he'd have to do something dramatic. And so he put himself on tape. He auditioned himself, reading passages from the book, and mailed the tape in to Peter and Fran. And as a result of what they saw, he immediately came into the running. He was actually the first person cast, the first deal made, and Peter and Fran, everyone would look at dozens, if not hundreds of people for roles. At New Line, we would only get the finalists. And when that tape came in, there was no dispute. I mean, you didn't even have to look at anyone else. I mean, it was so clearly and instantly apparent that Elijah Wood would play that role. There was just no debate.
The first time you hear Sauron's theme is where Gandalf leaves Frodo and they cut to that shot of that panning up of Barad-dûr.
This is the first big reveal of Barad-dûr, which is one of the big strongholds of Sauron. Alex Funke designed the miniature move for it, and then we had to extend the terrain out to a CG Psyche, which had the volcano and all the clouds and whatnot. And then also we had to track the model and create as much geometry in order to put digital orcs running around, rebuilding it.
It's a miniature. It's built at 166 scale, so it means that people standing in it would be about 1.5 millimeters tall. The camera's just barely skimming the surface. It's so close. It's all built out of cast resin. It's a beautiful miniature. Here's Minas Morgul with the Black Riders coming out. They're blue screen. They shot them just against the blue sky, and then the miniature's shot with glowing paint on it to make that sickly glow. Here comes Gandalf coming up towards Minas Tirith in the dawn. Here's a beautiful shot of Minas Tirith coming up in the dawn light. He said it had to look like Constantinople in the morning, some kind of a National Geographic shot. This is a 1/72nd scale miniature. We shot it pretty much as you see it there.
Yeah. Well, they call them bigatures instead of miniatures because they were so gigantic.
So gigantic and so many of them. We used extensive amount of miniatures, more than I think many modern films use, because it's easy to do certain things in CG, but there's a certain presence and feeling to a miniature that I think greatly enhances our movies.
No, and it goes back to Peter. I mean, the very first film Peter made, Bad Taste, 16 millimeter. I mean, I knew very little about special effects when I first saw it, but there's the climax of the movie is a house launching itself into outer space, and it never occurred to me back in the late 80s when I saw that it must be a real house, but no, Peter's got that house in his garage. It's about maybe 3 feet by 3 feet, and it's got the little rocket engines in the bottom.
The markings upon the band begin to fade.
At one point, we weren't just storyboarding, but then doing previous 3D shots, but we were also then cutting them together and creating a version of the movie, if you will, before we even shot anything. This sequence is a perfect example where, even though it was never storyboarded, never prevised, it was shot very late in the game as a pickup. The one interesting little fact about it is the actor playing it, Cameron Rhodes, who you can see right here, is a Wellington-based New Zealand actor. He played the voice for one of the characters in our animatic. So what we did is we hired local New Zealand actors just to play out almost in the form of like a radio reading of the movie, and then we put those audio tracks over the storyboards.
I always loved the Green Dragon
Yeah.
sequence. It was a fun scene for me, and it also showed the friendship and the kind of awareness of somewhat of the outside world and how isolated these guys were. The people in the Green Dragon discount all these rumors and stories, and they have a great time there, and I actually loved that sequence.
A little romantic thread there, which we pick up outside the Green Dragon as well. But yes, chopping this was part of moving through Hobbiton a bit quicker to get the boys on the road where the story really took off.
Sam's desire to really approach Rosie Cotton, which plays out much later.
Yeah, it's going to be a huge deal in film 3. It's toward the end of film 3. You're going to really want to harken back to that.
So some of these things that are reinstated in the cut help set up what happens much, much later in the story. It's great to have them. And it's great to have them now right before you're going to see the next film theatrical so that you can actually gain some insight into the motivations of these characters.
I remember it was a momentum pace cut, because the idea that you would go from Gandalf looking up from the Minas Tirith scroll and go, Frodo, and then suddenly you're back in Hobbiton, and within moments he's in his dark Bag End about to be jumped on, one presumes, by a ring wraith, but of course it's Gandalf. And I remember, because I agree with Barry, it was great, but it was strictly a momentum pace edit.
So this is kind of those filmic moments that Pete does best, this whole build-up of tension. There's absolutely no reason why Frodo would come home and his windows would be open and there'd be papers scattered around and stuff just because Gandalf was there, but it just makes it creepy. It just makes it kind of builds the tension and puts you on edge. It's great.
Ian McKellen,
yeah,
playing Gandalf, he really had a fantastic sense of humor.
He's amazing in the fact that he doesn't look like Gandalf at all. Like when you meet him, he just looks completely different. One of the guys at Digital had to scan his face for Gandalf, the digital double, and so he got Ian in, and Matt, who's our head of models, was going to scan him and said to Ian, well, we just need you you need your face in a neutral pose. And he was like, well, neutral for me or neutral for Gandalf? Because neutral for me is like this, and neutral for Gandalf is this. And Matt said his face just completely changed. He just sort of pursed his lips and furrowed his brow, and his cheeks sucked in. And it was just like bang. It was completely different. I mean, obviously Gandalf has a prosthetic nose as well, but there's just something else.
Oh, it's his acting.
Carries his eyes and his
it's amazing.
mouth. Just completely changes. Absolutely incredible. That someone can have that much control that, they can create a whole new neutral look for someone else from them for a character that remains consistent the way it does.
In order to pull these shots off real effectively, you really need to rehearse it so people know where they're supposed to be looking at certain props and where the teapot really is, and just to be able to do just little actions to help sell it, like having two props that are of different sizes right next to each other and having both characters touch or interact with them and whatnot. It just really helps sell the whole illusion. And it's all done in camera, which is a cost savings.
Bilbo found it.
This is the first opportunity we had to make the ring sound, the vocal sound, come through for the ring. Peter was very keen that we give the ring character and give it emotion. But it has to be subtle because that's the way the ring works. Kind of not human, but definitely alive.
When we got to the final mix, we actually worked at sort of carving some space within the music to really let the voice of the ring come through for the first time in such a way that it actually gets the attention of Frodo and Gandalf, and it's really calling out to them, and it's really when you first feel that this sort of presence within the ring. There's virtually nothing else on the soundtrack but the voice of the ring, and that allowed us to play it at such a low, subtle level that sort of sucks you in.
Well, this is critical stuff, because everything that happens in this scene, if you don't grasp it successfully, which thankfully you do, nothing else really resonates for you the way it's supposed to. Peter and the editor, John Gilbert, they really did an elegant job of finessing this whole section, because in less deft hands, this whole sequence could have bogged down entirely, and really destroyed momentum and pace, but it really gives you a lot of information in an entertaining and engaging way.
Keep it hidden. We never speak of it again. No one knows it's here, do they?
This is another good example of just a two-pass blue screen motion control shot where Ian McKellen, as Gandalf, is shot in small bag end first. Pete selects that take, and then we take all that move data, scale it up in this case, and shoot Elijah Wood against blue screen.
But the enemy found him first.
The scene, it was completely shot in camera, not intended to be an effect shot, and we had makeup extensions on the fingers, which looked great, but the main thing was it was a human actor and the forearms felt very thick, and the hands, if anything, they weren't actually frenetic enough. They didn't feel like he was actually getting spiked or tortured. And so we actually had to replace them. We had to actually paint out the hands in front of moving smoke, which was no fun for our digital paint artists, and then put in the digital Gollum hands. Because Bag End had a lot of circular walls, there weren't a lot of that would actually fly away. So you had the normal size set of Bag End in which a human actor was Hobbit size, so it had a lot of headroom and it felt comfortable. But then you had these smaller ones, and you had to get a full human size film crew in there, so it was like, you know, everyone bunched up against the walls.
There are a few major walls that could fly out, and those were used quite often when you actually wanted to get your motion control rig in there.
Sure.
To be able to handle some of those forced perspective shots, you really needed to have that depth. So those major walls would fly out, but you're absolutely right. A majority of it was a completely intact set, and you would have to sort of wind your way through.
What must I do?
You must leave, and leave quickly.
Where? Where do I go?
Get out of
I always get a kick out of that moment where Gandalf folds Frodo's shirt nicely, and then Frodo just kind of yanks it and throws it in his bag.
When we say things like motion control, recording the camera movement, pretty much it's a motorized camera dolly that the camera's only moving because motors are moving it. And each one of those motors, if it's going forward or backwards or how fast it's moving, is all being recorded by a motion control computer. And that move data, once we have it, we can do anything to it. We can scale it up, scale it down, make it twice as big, half as big, rotate it around, and that gives us the ability to shoot different passes in different locations, either exactly one-to-one or scale them up in order to put people in miniatures, or just do the subtle scaling that we do in order to create a human and a hobbit standing next to each other.
You can learn all that there is to know about their ways.
There were a number of Sams, all out of Britain, and no one necessarily looked at Sean because, of course, Sam needs a fair amount of weight on him, and no one was necessarily looking that way, but Sean did audition, and he just had the right energy, you could tell. But Peter said, listen, if you're really serious about this part, you're going to have to put on, I think he put on well over 30 pounds to play the role. When the filming was done, we actually, because we were so grateful, he did such a great job, we actually paid to get him a trainer so he could lose the weight.
But even during the filming, when they first came here, we one of the things we did with all the actors is got a personal trainer here to work with them so that they'd have the stamina to get to a 15-month shoot. And they all had this guy named David Nuku, and I actually had to go to David and say, no, you have to understand, we're not really trying to get Sean into shape here. We want him, it's fine for him to work up on his upper body, but we don't really want the aerobics going too strong on Sean.
Yeah, and whenever he would do a lot of exertion, he would always be saying, I'm not used to having to carry around 30 pounds more.
In fact, Michael Lizomatic did a great job with the dialogue track overall and giving it realism, you know, putting you places, and just the whole sound we actually got out of the mix for the dialogue was the best my experience ever.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much about sort of putting you in the space and in the environment that happens in such a subtle way with the sound that I think most people never even pick up on, but just with what's done with reflections and echoes and reverb to really sort of create this whole three-dimensional environment with the sound. I mean, the picture is flat, one dimension in front of you, but with the sound, it's all around you. And that's the kind of subtle thing you can do with the soundtrack that sort of that affects how people perceive the film, but it's not the type of thing that people think about.
The scenes in the movie, this is the one with the infamous car in the background, which, by the way, we didn't know it was there, but we thought no one will ever see that. But we have taken it out for the DVD. People who can still frame the DVD, I guess, and look for the infamous car, so it's gone. I guess for the DVD, we put back scenes that are not necessarily required for the story, but scenes which add depth and character to it. I mean, that was the feeling generally. There's a lot of cool scenes that got left out just because they held up the narrative. Now, we have quite a bit of material of Sam and Frodo on the road, which we took out of the theatrical version. Again, they're pretty cool little scenes where we get to see Sam being entranced by the elves. And we also get a sense the world is changing, the elves are leaving, things aren't going to be as they were.
This scene was actually a hard-lost scene because it was actually one of Bob Shaye's favorite visuals. Bob Shaye, who's the chairman of New Line, this kind of ethereal procession of elves going, but it was actually ultimately cut relatively early in the process because of pacing issues.
I remember shooting the scene, and in fact, I remember shooting it twice. The first time we went up to Mount Victoria, and it was one of those wild, windy Wellington days, and everything was blowing every which way, and we're trying to get these elves to glide across the landscape. And I actually thought it was quite effective because you had the wind blowing the grass, this tall grass. We sped the camera up a little bit so that on screen everything would be slowed down slightly. But it was quite a challenge to shoot, and worked well, but we then reshot it again a second time. And then ultimately we cut it out of the theatrical version of the film for pace reasons.
This was a nice little scene where Sam and Frodo are attempting to get to sleep, where they get interrupted by a small animal in the end. I guess it's like hobbits getting out into the wild, a world away from the comforts of their home. But, you know, not really that necessary for the theatrical version. No, the animal doesn't even make the DVD version, I'm afraid. There was 29 takes of a deer sniffing around them, and various different animals were tried too. There were rabbits and all sorts of, I think there's 3 or 4 different creatures.
In this shot, actually, the only miniature part is the tower, but it's a combination of matte painting, and that's a miniature bridge that he goes under also. And then we've got here we're coming up on another version of Orthanc, beautiful cast shadow. This is the very first Orthanc shot. This is the one where we did the reflections in the trees. Here's the miniature again with green photographs of the trees reflected in the base to get the right colors. And there's Saruman coming down. That's the miniature behind him again. The camera is only about 3 inches away from the miniature during this shot. Had a lot of trouble keeping everything in focus. Here it is again, reflecting a painted blue sky and green photographs of green trees at the base. That's the kind of thing that you have to do to really tie it into the set. And it's especially something like that that's shiny, where it really does echo what it's surrounded by, and you can't really fake that kind of thing. You can try with pieces of green paper, but the fact is we went out to the location where the live action part of it and basically panned the camera around, the still camera around, shot a bunch of stills, and then made big prints of them, and then wrapped the set with it so that we had the correct reflections.
He cannot yet take physical.
Now, Christopher Lee, this is an interesting casting story because, of course, originally he read when we were concerned that we would not get Ian McKellen. Obviously, we were planning backup plans, and Christopher Lee, who actually knew Tolkien when Tolkien was alive, had auditioned for Gandalf, but ultimately came to the conclusion himself that really it would have been no good if he had gotten the part, because he really wouldn't have had, at 79 years old when he was cast, to go, to just the sheer stamina of it. And we were really fortunate that he was willing to play the part of Saruman, which he plays brilliantly, because it just gives you that immense sense of history that he brings to it is irreplaceable.
And Christopher is a man that has read the book every year since the year it was published, I believe.
Yes, and as he's quick to point out, Ian McKellen is a spry 60, so naturally he can deal with the rigors of Gandalf perhaps a bit better than the now 80-year-old Christopher Lee can. What's also great, which has nothing to do with the film directly, is that Christopher Lee is like outrageously multilingual. He can actually speak a smattering of seemingly at least a dozen languages. When we were doing press for the movie in Cannes, and the international journalists would come up, and he could literally have passable conversations with nearly all of them. He's also about 6 6.5 feet tall, so he's got an amazingly imposing presence. Because Ian McKellen is not exactly small.
A lot of these interior Orthang shots that involve the Palantir also required us to paint out the space lights, which are part of the lighting rig overhead that was set up. The ball is very reflective, so you pretty much see everything.
So PJ's idea with the wizard fight was basically to keep it very real in a way that it wasn't so much about their magic as it was about these two old men just beating the crap out of each other in this room, you know, flinging each other around. So it was really about having the realistic Foley sounds, the sounds of, you know, them slapping the ground, and not so much about the whizzes and all the sort of magic sounds, but really more just the very physical nature of these two guys getting slapped around.
I remember one weekend I came into the post-production sound facility, and there was our sound designer, David Farmer. He had a mic out by the front windows of the building, and he was taking his hands and kind of streaking them against the glass. And I said, "What are you doing, David?" He said, "Oh, I'm getting sounds for the wizard fight."
Peter was very insistent that we didn't use anything that was at all electronic or sounded created, which produced a bit of a challenge for Ethan and Dave to come up with a movement energy sound that was just like sort of gusts of the wind, wasn't it, really?
Mm-hmm.
No electronics allowed.
Initially, I really wanted to get the sense of what the force that was traveling between the two wizards, and trying to figure out a way to do that without having it be sort of unnatural was a bit of a challenge. And so it ends up really just being these sort of sharp, windy gusts.
Mm. Now, wasn't there some sort of issue about droughts, that like the corn wasn't going to be the right height for the hobbits in scale or some such thing?
Yeah, it was a tricky time. We wanted to get to Hobbiton. We filmed this close to Hobbiton, and we wanted to get to that location at the right time of year before summer, which of course in the Southern Hemisphere is before the end of December. We wanted to film it because then we took a break. And unfortunately, we had rain and so forth on the South Island. It delayed our getting both to Hobbiton, which we were afraid was going to turn brown, and to this cornfield, which we were afraid was going to wither from the drought. So we set up a system to keep this well watered during that delay and over our Christmas break.
Coming up very soon in this piece is where the boys hear Farmer Maggot screaming at them across the paddock. And we had an actor in to do the lines for us, and Peter heard them in the mix and went, no, he doesn't sound scary. He's not angry. There's no emotion, there's no anger in there. So he turned around in a rather full screening room and said, "Hoppy will do it. Hoppy, that's you." So it was my mission the next day, was to get into a studio and scream abuse. And it was very hard to string together a stream of profanity and all the rest without actually swearing, but getting angry. But I think it kind of worked, and nobody really spots my Kiwi accent doesn't really show through too strongly, I don't think.
And you've upheld your record of getting your voice in every soundtrack you've worked on.
Yeah, just about. There's not many I haven't.
The cool thing about this whole sequence, this is what we called the Wooded Road. And in terms of our first day of shooting ever, this was it. With our guys here, with our hobbits, who you couldn't get a better bunch of actors, man. They were so great.
Yeah, this Wooded Road sequence was another prime example of how willing Peter was to drop all other elements away to allow space for a sound moment to make the point that he wanted it to. And all the feedback we've had subsequently has been that this is one of the scarier moments in the film.
This next shot coming up of them hiding is actually, I'm pretty sure this was the very first day of shooting, and it involved a 2-pass scale comp where they come over the edge, hide underneath in the roots and whatnot, and then the camera lowers down and pushes in as the horse comes over the top. They did the first pass with the hobbits, got a good camera move and stuff they liked, and then they scaled that move down and ran it at, I think, probably 48 frames a second in order to get the slow motion of the horse, but then the whole move locks together and whatnot. And after so many years of planning and talking about techniques and nervousness about starting the show, of course, the very first day, possibly the very first shot, they decided, well, let's just go for broke. We're going to do one of these 2-pass motion control things.
And not only did we have makeup artists for cast, but we actually had several makeup artists that just did things like the horses, like the Wraith horses, which look horrible. We had a guy named Mark Kinniston Smith, who was our head animal makeup artist, who added the blood and the kind of feeling that he has a nail through his hoof, which of course is all false.
The idea with the Black Riders is they're almost anti-life. So when they are introduced in this scene, they're really sort of sucking the life and the energy out of the environment. We really were able to make that point by dropping away all the backgrounds, dropping away really all the other sounds.
Putting in birds flying away and to really heighten that moment. And the horse, Peter was wanting this really wheezy, asthmatic sounding horse vocals, again to reinforce the unhealthy nature of these wraiths.
Now all the stuff in the woods, again, was just shot on the town bell just behind Wellington. And this sequence coming up right here where you've got the hobbits running at nighttime, you see the wraiths. Now these wraith shots here were done as sort of pickups to help kind of add to the weight of everything. But these shots in here, this was done from the beginning of the shoot. And this was all done at night. It's actually quite remarkable because if you look at the sequence, you really don't see much rain. Yet throughout that evening, off and on, we had huge rainstorms, gigantic rainstorms occurring. And we shot from the 30th of October in the evening into the wee hours of the 31st of October, which for you Americans out there and perhaps from people from other countries, that's Halloween, the 31st, which happens to be Peter Jackson's birthday. And so in the midst of trying to shoot on this slope in the town belt, in the middle of these rainstorms, trying to still get the shots, at midnight, the crew stood there and sang happy birthday to him, and it was a really great moment. But it was pretty remarkable. We got to the point where we had to actually start carrying hobbits from their number 2 position back to the number 1 position where they start running because there was so much rain and so much mud everywhere. We were knee deep in it, and we couldn't afford them to have a bunch of mud and rain on their hobbit feet because, of course, it's very difficult to clean them. We had very little time to get all the shots done.
The screams of the ring wraiths, these were something that sort of got redesigned very late in the game. After one of our playbacks in the middle of our final mix process, PJ said, well, this is really one thing that's really just not working yet, so we should take a look at some different approaches. Then it came up that Fran has a wicked, horrifying scream.
Yeah, Fran Walsh has got the highest pitched scream anybody I think has ever heard. She can just hit this incredible note with such power.
Yeah. So we dragged her onto the Foley stage the next day and recorded her, and there were 3 of us in there, and it just surprised us all. She's got some lungs on her. Pretty much knocked us on our ass. The first scream overloaded all the 3 different rigs we had recording it. Anyway, so her scream became the new sort of core element for the Wraith screams.
This gate was built in Shelley Bay on a military base. Actually, they're a backfield up in the mountains above Shelley Bay or the hillside.
You know, classic tricks that we pulled were when the hobbits arrive at Bree, we had the gatekeeper, and then we had 3 scale doubles, and then we had Merry on his knees at the back of the group in a close-up turning. But he's just on his knees to get him down to that height. What we're saying is that you may film this scene traditionally on a 32mm lens, but what we're using is a 24. So we're sort of playing with the perspective a little bit. Pete's cameo on the Bree Street, he didn't tell me he was going to do it, so he ducked off set for a while, and we were getting the scenario set up. We were walking up the street, and the camera's sort of veering from one side of the street to another as carts and people are going past, and then it's sort of heading towards this guy on the veranda who sort of like turns at the last minute and goes, you know, like this. And I just went, I sort of like, what the hell? Like this. And then, you know, the camera keeps sort of heading towards him. And this was fairly early up in the shoot, so I thought to myself, oh my God, is everyone getting a cameo? And I made sure we did enough takes to make sure he gave enough performances that he could choose from.
Next shot's a good example of just planning out just really good solid force perspective where the counter's up high, they're further away, and in order to help sell the illusion, one of our large scale puppets walk through and just sort of interact with them.
But right here is actually a big rig, a person on stilts.
Animatronic hands.
Yeah, these animatronic hands, and they do work quite well, but they obviously aren't as free-flowing as a normal person would be walking around, so we didn't use them as often as we could have once we found the tall people that could work.
We had lots of fun with the Loop group, and that's where we'll get maybe 20 actors in a studio and just get them to give us the general background, banter and chat and whatever. And most of the sound team had a chance to get in there and give us a few comments. It's always nice to involve the team. Yes, of all the Loop group type sequences we had to do in the film, I think the Bree the Prancing Pony worked the best in terms of just the whole feeling of it being not a very nice or overly safe place to be.
Well, Bree was pretty much the first time the hobbits really impact on the outside world. It's a more aggressive landscape, and now they're dealing with, there's a lot of humans in this environment. We wanted to introduce feelings of menace, so probably people's initial feelings about like the insides of pubs, you know, in England on a cold night. We still had those sort of qualities because it's lit by fire and candles and things. But what we did is we shifted some of the colours into a slightly uneasy part of the spectrum. What Peter calls urine gold, but I make it more a little yellow-green, because green can be a very just slightly queasy colour. So you can move like a traditional orange into a slightly green direction. And what happens is it now starts to make it not such a solid colour. It starts to make it a colour that's like between two colours. And so what it tends to do in a subliminal sense, it tends to give people a certain feeling of unease. That was what we were trying to do, was just create the subtext for how the hobbits felt in this environment.
This is really the second chance that we had to show how the ring is starting to affect Frodo, and with this evil voice, put him into a trance. We're really trying to show here how the ring is trying to pull Frodo to Sauron.
And it's the first time the ring actually speaks to Frodo.
This is probably one of the most fundamental, just straight two-pass motion control scale comps, where we shoot the bar patrons first, push in on them, scale that move, and set up the Hobbit on a stool and blue screen, and pushing on him, different scale.
Wraithworld was a interesting complexity in that Peter wanted this world that's obviously uneasy to be in, because otherwise you'd stick the ring on and live there all the time. So he wanted this idea that when you got into this Wraith world, it was this place that you just wanted to kind of not be around too much. So we came up with this kind of shredded, windswept look where it was just kind of constantly tearing apart the set.
And the Eye of Sauron was a ever-evolving design process.
Still is.
Yeah, it still is. I tried to conjure up so many rationales in my head as to what it actually was, but at the end of the day, we just wanted a filmic image of this flaming eye, this flaming energy, this entity that resembles an eye, somewhat surrealistically, like if you looked in the clouds and you saw an eye, that kind of image rather than an eye on fire or a physical lizard or cat's eye.
We tried to incorporate quite a bit of black speech into the Sauron Ringworld moment. Also played with a few English lines for Sauron, just to help the audience understand more about what was in it going on. But we were initially concentrating mainly on these black speech phrases and snatches of words.
The idea there really was that it didn't have to be so understandable. It's more about getting the feeling of this evil presence represented by the voice across. So we tried layering black speech on top of common tongue and just sort of weaving it all together, really to create more of a feeling than an actual sort of understandable dialogue.
Mm.
Now, were these guys on skates, the Wraiths? I mean, the way they move, it looks almost unnatural. They're floating by.
No, we shot slightly a faster frame rate, so they were slowed down.
Really, the big obligation with the ring race was just to keep their faces black, like so black that you feel like you could reach into the hood and there's nothing there. And so basically, in principle, what I did is I always backlit them or side-lit them, but I never put any light on them from the front. And if there was any light, if they were interacting with other characters and I needed light coming onto the other characters from the front, I would always be trying to cut it off the wraiths. And with black material, generally talking about reflective qualities of various materials, which you generally enhance, or the texture of them you enhance by bringing in light from behind or from the side.
What's great about this scene is that even though Aragorn is essentially telling the origin story of the ring wraiths, I mean, what's really being said subtextually is, you know, that's not the road that I want to go down, because, of course, what he knows and no one else knows in the film at this point is his origin, you know, as a future king of men, and it's, you know, there by the grace of the devil might go I. So, that's what makes the film so great, is that it does operate as a pure adventure movie, but it's also got all these layers that are accessible, if you want to look for them.
Neither living nor dead. At all times they feel.
Well, leaving Bree is now the Fellowship as joined by Merry and Pippin. There's 4 hobbits now. They've met Strider in Bree, and you hear the Fellowship theme taking shape. It's not in its full form. You only hear part of the theme. It's orchestrated in a very sort of journey, they're on the journey approach. It's not in its full heroic form. It's more in a kind of arduous form, if you will, because they're on this very strenuous journey.
This line, Frodo saying, "Look fairer but feel fouler," it's a line from the book which we cut in the theatrical version. We wanted to inject some urgency in this part of the movie. They've just escaped the ring wraiths, so we wanted to really keep it moving here, the feeling that they were kicking on to Rivendell. Strider was moving them along. We didn't want to hang around for too much conversation. But it's a cool line, so it's there for the DVD.
This location is a location we filmed at outside of a town called Tiano. And we started out the day, and it started raining, and we decided we'd film anyway. And shortly, after about an hour of filming, it turned into snow. And eventually, it got so heavy that we were forced to wrap and go back to our hotels. And Viggo wanted to continue to film, of course, but the police actually came to us and said, if you don't leave now, the rivers are flooding, you'll never get across the bridge, and you'll have to spend the night out here in the snowy field. So we decided we'd wrap. Not only were we flooded out, but all the lakes around had flooded. Our unit in Tiano, which was doing the horse chase sequence, was flooded out. Our unit in Queenstown was flooded out, and not only flooded out, but the lakes in both towns, in Wanaka and where we were going to go to in Queenstown, both towns were actually flooded, so that you can only get around town by canoe. I remember we scouted Midgewater Marsh, and in the actual location we filmed, and we landed on a helicopter in this bog, and it's actually like floating moss or peat or something. And we land, and the helicopter's kind of sinking in, and Pete is there, and we're looking, and it looks like the water's really shallow. You can see the bottom. We think, well, I guess you could walk out there through the marsh. We could have the hobbits walk out there through the marsh. So Pete decides to try it, and of course he's in his conventional shorts, and it's pretty cold outside, and he takes a step and he sinks up to his hip because the bottom is a false bottom, and it just keeps going. So we actually had to plot out very carefully we were going to film that sequence in that marsh.
This scene, though, with Aragorn is more interesting. It shows a bit more of Aragorn's backstory when he talks about elves and their immortality. I always felt there was a problem appearing in this part of the movie because we don't know about his romance with Arwen and his being conflicted about having a romance with her and her losing her immortality. Of course, if he's noble, he'll walk away and allow her immortality. But at this part of the movie, we don't know anything about that, so it was an easy scene to take out. We tried for a while to put it in after the crows scene, after they've left Rivendell, in another version of the movie, where we felt it had some relevance, where you knew about his romance with Arwen. But in the end, when we were cutting things back and trying to focus the movie more on Frodo, Aragorn's backstory became less relevant and easier to cut.
Now, in terms of this sequence, Saruman accessing the Palantir and responding to Sauron, we definitely shot a fair amount of material for this stuff. I kept going back and shooting more and more different angles, just to keep it interesting.
The orcs pulling the trees down was the first big extra call for Weta Workshop and getting lots of extras in makeup out on location. And the nights we did this out of Harcourt Park with a prop tree that would fall down, and it was just raining. The scene wasn't designed for rain, but then at the end of the day, you've got plates that do that, and Pete incorporates that to the rest of the sequence. And like big pull-out shots like this of Gandalf on top, you know, having the additional rain just makes him look more wet and pathetic and beat up, and it just creates a bit more of a violence to the whole sequence.
The idea with this tree chopping, killing scene was Peter was really interested in featuring the voices of the trees more than the sort of actual physical sounds. So Dave Farmer and Tim Nielsen worked at creating the sort of voices from whale sounds and all different types of animal sounds to really get the sense that all these trees were moaning and crying out in pain.
Isengard is the industrial age, and it's written in 5/4, which is a rhythm that I used only in Isengard and only to evoke this kind of things being a little off kilter. I mean, the 5/4 rhythm is a little unusual enough that it always felt a bit unresolved whenever you were in Isengard. And the orchestration is very metallic. You know, it's chains and metal percussion, and it's actually quite simplistic. It's a two-part counterpoint with this 5/4 rhythm and all low horns all playing in unison, and very primal and somewhat scary.
What's great about these weathertop shots is, yeah, we put the ruins and stuff on top, but this giant rocky mound really exists in New Zealand, and it's really that big, and it's really that cool. You get that stuff for free in New Zealand. It's just amazing.
The majority of the stuff shot at Weathertop, in terms of all these shots here with the fire, are on sets, and you just have these wide establishers. This POV shot of the race coming towards the hill was actually shot in the town belt in Mount Victoria, just behind Wellington, where we're looking down at the race. But outside that, the majority of these shots here are all just on a set. And you know, whenever we see beyond it, that's where the world of visual effects help us out greatly.
Our swordmaster Bob Anderson said, for every day we have a sword fighting scene, for every sword on set, we need 5 copies for each actor or stunt guy that's fighting. Richard Taylor, who ran Weta Workshop, thought to himself, 5 copies each day, that's way too many swords. We can't afford to build that many swords. So Richard set out to figure out a way to shockment the end of the hilt of the sword into a pommel so that they wouldn't break on impact. And he came up with this idea of mounting them inside of a rubber sleeve and molding that around the end of the sword. And that worked so that we never broke a sword. Yeah,
it was a skateboard wheel rubber, polyurethane, I think is what it's called, that they put in the hilt, so the shock wave would travel down the aluminum and get absorbed or displaced, really, not absorbed, displaced in this skateboard wheel hilt.
Hearing the voice of the ring as Frodo pulls the ring out of his pocket was one of those concepts that we seem to be going around and around and about. Whether or not it was a good idea to actually have a talking ring. In the end, we ended up having the voice of the ring come through, calling out to Frodo to put it on, and then he goes into Wraith World.
Most of those elements of Frodo was just shot against blue screen, camera track all the background environments into, which was just kind of these ethereal cloud-like layers. But the big part was getting this kind of streak effect in this three-dimensional sort of world. This whole thing had to be camera tracked. Particles had to be applied. What would happen is these streaks, which are being emitted off of these particles, you would actually streak the set, but in a 3D sort of way. So that as you came around, it didn't just look like a Photoshop 2D streak thing, but it actually had multi-planing qualities to it. So as you came around, the streaks that were coming around in front kind of occluded the ones in the back. And it was a key to kind of getting that dimensionality that all this stuff moved around in. And that it was actually part of the world as opposed to just a 2D effect that was added later.
Weathertop is primarily based around the Ringwraith theme, but it does also have elements of Fellowship theme. Aragorn saving Frodo. Once he puts the ring on, he saves him, and you hear elements of the Fellowship theme. But it's essentially based around Ringwraiths.
Those actors did a great job of moving so fluidly in those costumes too, because I was actually wearing one the day we sold Pete the costume. Man, it's so hard to move fluidly. You've got this armor on, these big boots, then you got all this cloth on you that's sort of catching every limb, and you can hardly see out of them. And for them to actually get such fluid, graceful motions is actually pretty astounding. They did a really good job.
The scene changed a bit in the mix. Some versions the Wraith screams were too big, and some versions the Wraith screams were too low, and and in the end, it's the one scene that most people agree it can be painful.
Peter's really direction in this scene is that they should be painful, and the scene should be painful. It's always a fine line between not chasing the audience out of the theater and making them feel like they're actually there.
So here we're going to have an amazing shot. This is a shot coming up on Orthanc. We go over the live-action guards. We dip down in here into this 35th scale miniature. This is one long, continuous tracking shot. But we got digital orcs all over the place in here. They're all driven, so some are chopping and some are hacking and some are sawing, and everyone has his own separate action. This is all shot as a set with the holes dug in the ground so we can have these pits hanging down. And the entire thing was built. It's about 60 feet across. The Moth, of course, he's a digital guy. Okay, now we're going to go to a digital Orthanc, because we saw the miniature before, but we could never go high enough on the miniature. So now this is a digital one that we're looking at. And now we're going to go up, and then as we go up the top of this digital tower, at the top we're going to go back to live-action Gandalf in the full-size set.
The moth in the hand is actually a real moth, whereas the other ones are all CG, but that close-up is actually a real moth, which they modeled the CG moth after.
The thing about that moth was we had to schedule that scene with Gandalf where we did the close-up to coincide with the time, the season that moths were going to be born, and actually be able to have a moth.
Now we're going to dive off the top of the tower, dive down, and we're going to go into a cavern at the bottom, plunge down through the earth, past all this stuff, right down to a live-action plate of the blacksmiths hammering away. These are the real blacksmiths who made the swords, incidentally. Okay, here's another miniature dropping this tree in, quarter-scale tree in a 14th-scale set, roughly half-scale water and loose leaves and stuff falling behind it. You're always sort of having to figure out what's the optimum scale to use on these things, because let's say if something's falling or bouncing or splashing or crashing, you can't use a small scale. You can't use a 12th or 14th scale because gravity is your enemy. But naturally, we don't make it any bigger than we have to, because just the limitations of how do you light it and where do you find a place big enough to drop it. Let's say a quarter-scale tree, that'll just barely react properly. Even then, the branches have to be made with springs and wires on them so that when it hits, it bounces properly, because if you just took a normal-sized tree, it would look much too brittle. It would basically just hit and the branches would break, whereas, of course, a big tree, the branches would flex and then bounce back. It's the birth of Lurtz with a miniature set behind him. Basically, this is a very simple blue screen foreground. Everything else in there had to be built.
The introduction of Lurtz, who's one of the few characters who was actually invented for the movie, as an actual sort of singular villain to fulfill an evident gap in the story that as it was translated into film.
And here's a great shot of Trollshire Forest, where, of course, the trolls that Bilbo refers to earlier are revealed. And one time the scene was expanded, and you actually heard from Sam, I believe it is, saying these are
Bilbo's
trolls. Look, Mr. Frodo, these are Bilbo's trolls.
We took this part out of the theatrical because we wanted to concentrate more on Frodo just being sick, but it's illustrating something from Bilbo's story earlier on, which, it's not entirely necessary, but it's kind of cool to see them.
And this was a difficult scene to film. We were in this little location on Mount Victoria, in this really heavy thicket that you could barely get the lights into. I don't know how the hell we actually filmed this sequence in retrospect. But however, this clearing was on a soundstage. And it was interesting. We used a double for Liv to come on the stage. She's not really that comfortable with horses, but she had to be on the horse for this scene.
Right.
And it was very uneasy for her, to come in a crowded stage on a horse. But she handled it quite well.
No, what's amazing is just what an amazing job between the stunt double, who does the bulk of the riding in this chase, and Liv. I mean, they really did a terrific job in terms of the wig and the makeup and just the casting someone that was the same sort of tall, leggy kind of physique that Liv has, because there's a lot of intercutting between Liv and the stunt rider.
I think I remember a funny moment where Viggo was chewing up the plant and he accidentally spat part of it onto Liv. And
onto a cheek, it actually looked pretty pornographic, actually. It was just sort of...
There's also kind of a funny moment when we were shooting this where Liv gets on the horse and rides off camera. I wasn't there, but I saw the dailies, but pretty funny to hear her on the dailies go, oh God, because the horse was kind of...
Not really a mass for long.
It was kind of running off.
She was great, but she was...
She hadn't spent that much time on a horse and obviously hadn't felt that comfortable yet.
One of the real challenges as far as the dialogue goes on the show was the fact that we had this Elvish language, which is a wholly invented language that nobody really speaks. So we had the Elvish language experts in the world, David Salo, helped out with the dialogue coach in developing an accent pronunciation guides and all that kind of stuff. And these actors had to come in and learn all of these lines in Elvish. And both Liv Tyler and especially Viggo, because he speaks quite a few languages himself, just managed to pick it up and make it sound as if they'd been speaking it their entire lives. Something we were all very happy worked out. But we had dialogue coaches on the ADR stage all the time just to make certain that we had the correct pronunciation, and the actors would have to spend hours in advance just practicing these lines.
The whole thing about the horse chase was essentially, it was done by the 2nd unit down in the South Island over about a 2.5-3 week period, and just found this huge plot of land with these trees that were in some parts clumped together and other parts just kind of opened up. We just had this great group of horse riders that just went all out, and it was amazing. The horses were fantastic, and the riding, the way they're sort of flying in and out of trees, just really expert riders. And the way we shot it quite often is we either had a road with a camera car, a road that we'd try to level as best we could, and had a camera car shooting some of that, as well as just throwing a camera on the back of a 4x4 little motorbike, like some of these shots. And then, of course, the chopper shots that you see in the sequence. But for the amount of time that we had to put into it, we definitely had to shoot for a fair amount of time for how short the sequence is. But to get the amount of coverage and the variety of angles and to really help get the best shots, it just took that little bit of extra time.
Creating this scene took a long time. We actually figured out a path through the woods, and we ran a camera car alongside and had little miniature trees that were on the camera car so that you could push them by the lens, so it would create this feeling that you're actually riding through this thicket, and actually very effective.
And this was also one of the last scenes. Even when we were in London scoring, we were still tweaking this scene because the feeling was this was sort of like a real standout set piece, and Peter had never really gotten a chance to edit it to his ideal liking. So we knew it was going to be roughly a certain amount of time. The length of the scene wasn't going to change, so there were adjustments made to it right down to the very last minute.
This is an interesting location. It's called Skipper's Canyon, which is near Queenstown, and it used to be a gold mining camp. And the only way to get in and out of this location is through this very, very windy road. The horses had to be brought in over trail, which took a day. They had to be sent in a day ahead of time with our wranglers so that they could camp out there. Our equipment and crew were helicoptered in. It's beautiful, beautiful little setting.
These horses at Fort Bruin were actually really fun for me. We spent a day out on this beach location, put up a huge blue screen in order to shoot these high-speed horses running toward camera away from the water horses. And in most cases, the horse riders were very excellent stunt riders, but I'd be looking through the viewfinder, a grip would be immediately behind me, ready to pull me out of the way in case the horse got into trouble and was going to crash into us. Well, probably ready to pull the camera out of the way and let me fend for myself. But in most cases, the horse is crashing by, hitting my shoulder, and everybody getting drenched with water. And just doing that over and over again all day long just to get some really cool, lots of gnashing teeth and swords and stuff flying through the air at high speed. Really fun. And they pay me to do this. It's amazing.
This whole sequence, Peter wanted to illustrate that the idea that Frodo had come so far and perhaps too little too late. And so we brought Liv and Elijah back to sort of create an illustration, and it leads into this delirium, what we call the delirium, because the original conception of the delirium at script stage was this tug of war over Frodo's soul between sort of Sauron and Elrond, but no one really ever had the time to fully conceptualize how one would show that pictorially. And ultimately, that the idea of having it turn it into an emotional moment rather than a sort of a metaphysical kind of a moment would have more power. And ultimately, it was a great instinct, because people who don't know the books really believed that Frodo had perished, and that fade to white and fade up, that he was maybe fading into heaven, who knew?
Rivendell is a good example of quite a variety of scenarios coming into play in one film environment. We built a set in the park at Kaitoki, so that was actually a real environment subject to real weather scenarios, and that was amazing. I mean, Grant just did this amazing job of, and Alan and Dan, of building the set right in through the forest and making the forest a part of the set.
What I love about the art direction and the set decorating here is everything here is manufactured specifically for the movie. So all that furniture, all the beautiful props and dressing, as everything else in the movie, made specifically for the film.
Now, there's another interesting editorial decision here. This scene was actually, in a prior cuts, was actually earlier, but Peter felt strongly that if you knew that Gandalf had escaped Saruman, then you wouldn't feel the same sense of jeopardy on Frodo's behalf, because you knew somehow that Gandalf was out there free again, that he could come, like the cavalry coming. Again, for people who didn't know the books, Peter was always trying to keep that well in mind. So the idea of showing it as this flashback, a memory flash, it's a nice bit of business, but it also kept Frodo in more jeopardy, through the previous, say, 10 or 15 minutes of footage.
So you have chosen death.
And I love this shot. This was an aerial shot we did on the South Island from a helicopter with a scenic unit. It's purposely for the shot. That's a real location. We did wind it backwards to get the effect and get the way we wanted the eagle to fly through there, Galware to fly through there. So the shot was played in reverse.
Frodo, he awakens from quite a long sleep. You actually hear a bit of the Shire theme when Sam approaches him.
By the skills of Lord Elrond, you're beginning to mend.
So Rivendell was built up in Katoki, but just in the sense of some of the buildings and a few of the interiors. So everything else, when you need a vista of Rivendell, what you need is a miniature to extend it. And then the valley that it's in, that's all practical scenic plates. Let's say Frodo walks outside one of the buildings. The building is just a little bit of a wall and a bit of a balcony. Everything else is the miniature, the 20th scale miniature. And we had very, very precise tracking information because, of course, the camera moves have to exactly match.
Then you actually hear the full, beautiful Rivendell theme on those wide shots of the valley. And then as it comes in closer, Frodo and Sam meet Merry and Pippin, and there's a reunion of sorts, still based around the Rivendell theme. And then as Frodo sees Bilbo off in the distance with his book, it changes into a really beautiful, warm version of Shire music, of Hobbiton music. When he sees Bilbo in Rivendell and Bilbo shows him his book, and then you hear a little fragment of that evokes the Shire theme. It's slowed down and it's a little warmer, but it brings you right back to Hobbiton, even though you are in Rivendell. It brings you back to that part of the story and where it began.
Rivendell and Lothlorien, we wanted to create certain factors that would be similar, certain physical qualities that would be similar with both kingdoms. However, they are entirely different places. So what we did is we wanted to create an autumnal feel, not only creating the kind of colours that we were looking for in Rivendell, but also as a statement of the decline of that city, almost like someone saying we're heading into fall and now we're starting to head into a subdued time. And we also diffused everything in Rivendell with diffusion filters and pro-mists just to soften the environment, because that was the one common element I planned to have with Lothlorien, which is an elvish visual symbol.
It's interesting actually to see the elements that went into Rivendell, because when you look at them just separately, it'll be literally a guy or the actor standing on a blue screen, and then it'll be a miniature house just kind of sitting in blue screen, a waterfall that was shot on the South Island. Somehow out of this you have to build a city. We took a lot of New Zealand photography. We took mountains and waterfalls and sky plates, and you start kind of cutting and pasting a lot of these things together so that when you're looking at it, you see this beautiful vista with this house and back walls, and then waterfalls. We might shoot real waterfalls and actually literally cut them out and stick them back there. Keep it as natural and real as possible, because you can't just go shoot Rivendell anywhere in New Zealand. You have to literally construct this thing out of bits and pieces of New Zealand. Because there is no place like Middle Earth. Contrary to what New Zealand says that this is Middle Earth, a lot of it was put together at Weta Digital in these different layers.
A lot of the times we would shoot these miniature elements as lock-offs, but shoot them in separate layers so that they could artificially generate mid-ground movement, artificial parallax, in other words. That was just so that if there was a case where the shot wasn't locked yet, they could essentially build the camera move in after the fact. It's a very useful technique. Of course, that's the thing that gives you the sense of motion, is if the foreground and mid-ground move relative to each other. It's artificial parallax. So if you shoot them in a series of layers on separate pieces of film, then you can move them when you put it together and create the effect that the camera's moving even though it really isn't.
The visual effects shot for the waterfalls in Rivendell were being worked on right up until the last minute. So we were on the dub stage constantly having the visual effects for the picture we were mixing to being updated, and every day we'd see sort of a new waterfall magically appear in the background, and so we just kept adding more water.
This was also additional photography, and this was not unlike the Bag End Kitchen. This is where you needed to communicate really critical exposition, but in an interesting and dramatic way. Clearly, it's not just a question of getting the ring to Rivendell, but what's about to happen. And if you don't know the books, you get to Rivendell and you're sort of thinking to yourself, all right, what now? And then you find out that getting the ring to Rivendell is the least of it. That there's this whole larger geopolitical kind of situation that's being laid out for you here. And as an audience member, you're sitting there thinking, oh no, there's like all kinds of stuff that's still coming. And it sort of almost presses your reset button in terms of pacing in your mind, in terms of the sort of the grammar of a film audience and how they pace themselves when they watch a movie.
The Rivendell exterior was at Kaitoki, which is a nature reserve. So we actually had to be, everything we did, we had to be very careful with the environment. The entire shoot, we had to be very careful with the environment. And, and I think to all the crew's credits, they were.
Traditionally, on most effects films, they shoot all the live action first, and then we shoot miniatures afterwards. But there were lots of instances where the miniature was shot first, and then we had to put the characters in after that. In some cases, putting digital characters, but in other cases, actually putting blue screen characters. There's a shot coming up where Isildur and Elrond are inside Mount Doom, this shot right here. We crane and boom up around, and they're standing on this large walkway of rock that extends out over the volcano. They shot the miniature first. It's a huge sweeping move. We had to figure out how to get our motion control equipment moving that fast and doing that big of a move. And our technical breakdown department was really good in order to re-engineer, get it to fit within the stage space we had. And I think eventually we had to shoot it at 18 frames a second for the speed. And luckily the actors were really good, and we could get them to act at a slightly altered speed in order to make the whole thing look right. You see this out-of-focus guy walking in the background. We shot miles and miles of footage of what we call pin block elements, and what they are is just lock-offs of elves and orcs and all sorts of different characters in costume, just doing little bits of random ambient business in front of a blue screen. We shoot it from different angles, so then we have a library of these things that our compositors can then put into the background of shots or put into miniatures just to make them look a little bit alive. Even though they're out of focus, you get more of a feeling like, oh yeah, that's a human or that's a living thing back in there, and it helps tie the miniature into a reality better. Used quite a bit in Lothlorien, used a lot in some of the caverns below Isengard shots. It's sort of a 50-50 when you want to use massive or when you want to use pin block stuff. If there's a lot of camera movement, you usually use massive. If it's just little tiny pockets of action you need, then pin block elements are usually what we use.
This is a cool little scene when Boromir first meets Aragorn. We trimmed most of it out for the theatrical version, where we get more of an interchange between Boromir and Aragorn. It helps the antagonism between them and the council scene to see more of this exchange, actually. But in the theatrical version, the other thing we thought was that we could play with more of the surprise of Boromir discovering Aragorn later in the scene when he's playing with the sword being the big moment in the scene.
Yeah, because there were cuts of the film where this scene did not play. It played qualitatively in terms of quality of performance and so on, but in terms of it was a head scratcher because people didn't quite appreciate what the significance of this mural was and what Aragorn's, what we came to call it sort of lineage guilt, was all about. But by now, and you see, oh, the sword, the mural, I get it. I've seen Isildur 3 times. I now understand. And it becomes really significant.
Yeah, it was a scene I've always loved, and it's a scene that's been in and out of the movie as well.
Yeah, many times.
This almost was cut because of that reason, because
Yeah.
it wasn't clear enough.
Which was a classic example in the editorial process of what you're cutting is actually not what's broken. It's something that leads up to it. It was a real benefit to find one's way editorially to the salvation of this scene. And then Peter and Fran actually improved it because now we're heading into an additional photography scene. This was, once the decision was made to keep the scene, once we had come up with this 3-part Isildur storytelling thing, the decision was made to add this scene so that you could realize that Arwen knows all about this, and 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 you see really the lineage guilt. This scene is all about the lineage guilt because he turns around and he says, "Same blood flows in my veins."
Now we're going to see Rivendell at night with all the interiors lit. We had hung a lot of fine voile-type fabrics, very fine silken fabrics inside the houses to create the sense that you were seeing something inside, some more detail inside, and also have something for the little tiny interior lights to light up. We actually shot this later on after we did the bulk of the Rivendell stuff. It was decided to do this as a new shot, specifically as an establishing shot, because we didn't have a lot of night stuff, because it was felt that jumping right straight into guys on the bridge would be a little too harsh. So they basically just took the live shot and just shrunk it down. We gave them an area down there where it would fit. Then they just tracked it to the miniature move.
We had some artwork actually of the bridge with Arwen and Aragorn. If you look at that image and you look at what we ended up with, it wasn't too far away conceptually. And Christian actually played Aragorn for us there in the still photo shoot. I could have sworn last time I was at Christian's house, there's a huge portrait of him as Aragorn over the dining room table, but I'm sure we can find something.
He lies.
She's such an iconic kind of movie star. It just helps reinforce that she's, thousands of years old elf, and that she has, it's not just that she can call up a raging river, but that she actually is wise, despite how young she looks. Because you realize this is not just some superficial, attraction between 2 very attractive people. It's like these guys have a history, and she understands his peril and his dark fate.
Enya, great Irish singer, and a fantastic voice, amazing voice. I always thought of hearing in Rivendell. It just seemed like a wonderful place to hear that voice. So she was approached and cast, really, for Rivendell.
An interesting example of how much things can change on the stage. We had recorded a group vocal track for the moment when Frodo puts the ring on the plinth and the crowd react, and it was supposed to be hushed awe and, oh, the ring is found. And all that. But when we came to the final mix, Peter didn't find that it had the flavour. It didn't have the emotional flavouring that he wanted it to. So we had group service, once again, the sound team to the rescue, out back, recording tracks and recording various things. And we were all very, very tired at the stage, and it just seemed to take us forever. And I think at one point we had PJ on the cell phone driving into the stage, giving us sort of a direction on how he wanted the loop group to be shaped. And so we had to busily get the shape together so that he walked in and we could play it to him, and he went, yes, no, add that, no, take away that, yeah, okay, fine, done.
And this was sort of one of the last things to be done at the final mix. Basically, we were told we had hours to finish, and that was it. So Barry Osborne was there checking his watch and giving us 5-minute updates on where the clock was at.
No pressure, mind. No pressure at all.
All that existed in this council chamber is just the floor and a little bit of the columns. Everything else is miniature. That's a very tricky one because it has to be dropped in front of the miniature. None of that stuff, none of those walls or anything exists. That's all part of the miniature set. All it was really built was just the stuff that's directly behind the actors.
This is a big trim we took out of the movie, which we've put back into the DVD. Boromir originally had two big speeches in the council scene, and Gandalf has a big moment as well. The council scene was always a very long scene, and we felt it was a bit unwieldy, I guess. And this little piece here, it could come out quite happily without hurting the storytelling of the scene. There's this effect shot, the Black Speech, which was a difficult shot. It was a difficult shot for the effects people. I don't think they ever felt entirely happy about it. And I know it was a really tricky shot for them.
I mean, here was a good opportunity to see a lot of different races all sitting together and interacting with each other and stuff. And in this, the dwarves were played by our scale doubles. They were already in the correct scale with the humans around them. Frodo was actually shot as a separate blue screen pass where you actually see Elijah's face. In wider shots or where you just get brief glimpses of him, that was also a scale double. When he stands up and walks forward and puts the ring on the plinth, that was first shot on the main stage, and then that move data again, scaled motion control off to the blue screen, set up Elijah, give him his marks, his eye lines, and rehearse it a few times to shoot his pass. Gimli comes up, tries to smash it. He just had an empty axe handle, and we put in a digital axe blade, which shattered.
With casting of Gimli, they put a lot of British, Scottish actors, big men on tape, big sort of barrel-chested actors, and all of them came across pretty one-dimensional, which was a real problem because the role needed to be more than merely comic relief. There actually had to be, the guy had to have a sense of a soul, a real soul to Gimli and his complexity, and it was a real worry. And we were actually getting ready, I forget the name of the actor, probably a good thing I'm forgetting, that we were nearly getting ready to cast sort of the best of what we had on offer, and then somehow one of our casting directors came across John Rhys Davies, and it was just immediate.
We destroyed Gimli, son of Gloin, by any craft that we hear.
To get the camera that close, all the different ring sizes, like for those close-ups, how to get because the camera can only get so close. They had some of the rings shot here are like the size of like a salad plate because to get the camera close without it blurring out. I remember seeing rings that were literally like, maybe 6-7 inches in diameter.
For the evil of the ring, you hear the voice of Sauron through the ring, and I use this North African instrument. That sound for the sound of Sauron, it's a very sort of crying, evil sound in the context. It's evil in the context of seeing it around the ring. You hear that sound and that theme plays over it. And you hear that at the Council of Elrond when Gimli tries to destroy the ring.
This is like nothing but reaction shots, and the amount of coverage, I must have watched days upon days upon days of dailies. People just doing reaction shots to what they're hearing, because it all plays on reaction shots and critically important ones, and the care it takes to get the coverage to make a scene like this work.
And it's a director's and a continuity person's nightmare because you have the old principle of the line and not crossing the line. Now you're in a circle. And how you create the coverage and create the dramatic tension in a scene when you've got so many actors sitting around in a circle is always quite a challenge.
This is a scene where it's really all about how the ring is trying to turn everyone against each other. And so the idea that PJ wanted us to get across was that Frodo starts to hear the voice of the ring, and it's calling out to him, and it's also sort of pitting everyone against each other. So the idea is that sort of the voice takes over and everything else drops into the background.
This reaction shot of Gandalf was reshot late in the game precisely because Peter wanted Ian McKellen to have that look that only the audience sees, like that he knows what a significant sacrifice Frodo is making by volunteering, more than Frodo can even possibly realize. And again, it's the luxury of shooting 3 films that we were still able to get shots like that. because the original shot, though good, didn't have that heaviness, that reaction shot does.
Well, the Council of Elrond is the fellowship being formed to support Frodo to take the ring to the Crack of Doom, and it's a very magic moment in the film. And Elrond says that you will now be the Fellowship of the Ring, and the music just swells, and you just hear that fully formed version of the Fellowship theme. You've heard all these little fragments of it up to that point, and it's the first time you just hear it in its glory. And then as the Fellowship leaves Rivendell, and they cross the pass, and you see each one of them in silhouette against the sky, the theme is again played in a really heroic version as they set out on their great mission.
It is hardly possible to separate you even when he is summoned to a secret council and you are not.
I love this too because Merry and Pippin, Dominic and Billy Boyd, I think primarily Dominic realized that the scale doubles we often use walked in a certain way, and that if he was actually going to make them believable, he couldn't count on them to mimic him, so he started mimicking them, and Billy and he did that together. It's really very clever.
But you see what I mean by that shot there, that composite of the three sizes of people? It took only 2 passes to do that because, you know, Gimli is already in scale with the Hobbit actors.
I'm Barry Osborne, the producer of The Lord of the Rings. Welcome to part 2 of the audio commentary featuring the production and post-production teams.
This is an interesting scene. Peter shot so much footage for this scene. I remember we were watching dailies and I had some crisis. I had to leave and there was, 3-4 hours of it. And it got reported back to me afterwards. Fran was sitting at dailies with Peter. I think she was trying to sleep. And she said to him about 4 hours in, "Look, Peter, take notice, even your editor's left. This is too much." So there was a huge amount of footage in different versions here. But again, it's Aragorn's backstory, but it was part of the focusing the story on Frodo. We felt we had to stay with that and we had to take some things out, and this was one that went. We experimented with putting this in Rivendell after they've met Galadriel, and Boromir and Aragorn have their little chat there. They talk about the White Towers and so on. We tried making a little flashback for Aragorn where we dissolved. Boromir says, "Do you remember the White Towers?" Aragorn drifted off into this reverie and had Elrond coming up behind him talking about, "You're the one to wield the sword, only you can do it." That was quite interesting too, but in the end it was easy to leave out. Well, medium easy to leave out.
It's so light.
It's a testimony to the attention to detail. When you see the engraving on Sting, and it's actually the exact engraving that's described in the book. I've heard different versions of what the translation of that Elvish writing is. One I heard said orc killer, but then I heard something a little more eloquent than that. But whatever it is, it's a complete match to what's described in the books.
Oh.
This is a great effect because it always shocks people, every audience you watch it with. And it's essentially a morph. They built a model, a scary Bilbo type model. And then
They did a live cast of Bilbo and then they sculpted into a really extended, grotesque expression. And so they morphed through various stages of real Bilbo into this prosthetic head they made. Yeah, so it was quite great.
It also follows the whole themes of duality that's like throughout the books and the movies. The idea that, you know, Gandalf and Saruman, Gollum and sort of Bilbo, Frodo, that there's sort of two, you know, Aragorn and Boromir. Wherever you look in Tolkien, there's this kind of, characters always represent different sides of like there, but for the grace of God goes a different direction that someone could have gone down.
The scene, them taking farewell from Rivendell, I thought quite early on we could do without it. It's a bit of talk telling us things we already knew. We know what the mission is, and I always felt that moment when Elrond said, "You are the Fellowship of the Ring," I wanted to see them kick out into the world, and it's one of those really cool cuts you can make which really propel the movie forward. There was a moment between Aragorn and Arwen which I know Fran liked and tried to keep in, but I think in the end it was a pretty good cut to take this out. There's an acute moment here though when Frodo, he's this hero who's taken on this huge mission, but the first step he's got to ask, well, is it left or right to Mordor? It's a nice moment.
It wasn't like it was a scene that was targeted by any particular notes from anyone. It was just the feeling that when you watch the cut and you had that great moment with Ian Holm and Elijah, and I'm sorry for everything. It's such a dramatic high. The feeling was we really should be on the road. We've sort of, Rivendell has peaked dramatically with that scene, and therefore the farewell, although it has a lot of wonderful things in it, that you really wanted to get the Fellowship on the road.
Here's one of our last views of Rivendell, where the Fellowship is leaving over the bridge. Full-size, real waterfalls dropped in there. Of course, the miniature, scenic background, and digital characters walking over the bridge. And then, of course, we pull back and it's even a little further in the background. That's a digital matte painting there. Part of the reason that scene works is they did one actor at a time. Instead of just trying to shoot the continuity, they basically shot the entire scene over and over and over again, featuring Boromir and then featuring Aragorn. And
these beauty shots are all shot on the South Island. Actually, I think this is a shot around Mount Owen. Really difficult location to film on, but we did it from a helicopter.
And this is something you actually shot. Is this shot for one of the trailers, or was it for the movie and then co-opted for the trailer?
Well, we were designing it, I think, for the film, but it was a trailer shot. And it was...
On a stage.
It was on a stage. And it was a multi-pass CG shot with all the different scales, so resizing the camera. And I remember Peter had shot it at 24 frames, and he said, I'd really like that at different speeds. So he left me the task of reshooting it at a 48 and I think a 36 frame rate. And normally what you would do would be go to a count that would be audible on the track. And in this particular case, I was not experienced at doing that, so I just decided I'd eyeball it on the screen. And I had it was really hairy to actually eyeball from the video monitor when you could bring in the next actor so that, say, Boromir or Aragorn wasn't walking into the back of Bill the Pony and disappearing. You had to actually time it out so they all crested the hill right at the right time without crashing into each other because they weren't there. They were different passes.
But this was featured in the very first internet trailer, and it was because we wanted something that had the entire Fellowship in a kind of real hero profile. And so I remember we called down and we said, we really need something like this. And I remember Barry said, well, actually, there's something that might just work that we've got in mind.
What is that?
And this was a great location. We were actually scouting by air, and our helicopter pilot leaned over to me and said, I know this location that has kind of an Easter Island head, kind of weird rock formation area. You think you guys be interested in that? And I said, well, we're in and we're actually in 2 helicopters. We're flying this way anyway. Why not make a detour? And I said, sure, let's see what you've got. And we flew over it and landed, and Peter fell in love with the location and thought it was a great spot to do the scene. So it was just happenstance that we found this. And of course, we were filming on this location. We had mountain safety there because the only access to this location for us was by helicopter. And we dropped everybody in, and we got up there this one day, and mountain safety said, we're gonna have to pull you off because there's a storm coming in. And sure enough, we started moving out, and it started raining and pouring. And we had already gone through all of our cover sets. Instead of throwing in the towel, I got up in a helicopter. My first AD told me that we had nothing else that we could shoot. We'd gone through all of our cover sets. And I thought, well, we're not going to accept that. So I looked at the script quickly, leafed through it, found about 5 scenes I thought we could shoot in the rain, grabbed a small helicopter, scouted locations, went back, grabbed Pete and said, Pete, I think I've got a couple of things we could do. He looked at the script. We got together and we flew out and found a location. So as the company was moving by helicopter down to trucks, we were directing them from the air to where we were going to film, and started doing a couple of scenes that we could actually do in the rain. And I remember Ian McKellen's face lit up because he realized we were serious about getting the movie done, and nothing was going to stop us.
And he got a real kick out of it, which was a real charge for us.
I used the sound of the boys also around the sound of the ring, of the seduction of the ring. Part of the seduction of it, I thought, was the regaining of lost life. And I thought the boys were such a great sound of that, of the seduction of it.
We want to explain a little bit more about how Saruman is influencing the course of events. So we're going to have the crows go and report to Saruman what they found. We're going to dive down the hole. We're going to dive down there with them. Okay, new set, new miniature set. Swoop around this set. They're flying around us. Going to go through this hole here at the end. Wow, okay, new set coming up. Flying through this new set. Going to go around the corner here, coming on to a new set, yet another miniature set with a blue screen foreground, and end up at Saruman where they swirl around his head and report what they found.
You tried to lead them over Garadras.
The only thing that's built here is just a few sticks and Christopher Lee in the foreground, and all the rest of that is a series of miniatures linked together. And then, of course, the crows are digital, massive crows. We're very proud of that shot. Here's a whole bunch of miniatures, again, built at 14th scale, which is really pushing the scale in terms of snowdrops, because it's very, very hard to get snow to behave. So we had to make a rather complex mixture of salt and bicarbonate of soda and microspheres of glass, all kinds of stuff that finally would behave the way snow really behaves, where it falls free but it clumps when it hits. Plus, of course, there's rocks mixed in with it also. Peter had some very specific things he wanted to have happen the way it hit the surface that they're walking on. So we had to rig out a way where we could preload all the different kinds of snow and then push them through a chute with hydraulics so they'd all fall in the right sequence and at the right speed. It's a big rocky set that's dressed with white wax that's sprayed on to make the ice, and then the dusty snow on top of that.
Here's a good example where we have to do a little bit of motion control and pin block, where we can't get as far away as we want from Christopher Lee, so we shoot a motion control pass of going by him, so then we can do that repeatedly and know that we can hit our marks correctly with his dialogue, but then we have to shrink that image down at the beginning and at the end and appear like he's further away. Then we just resolve it all when we do the camera move around the digital ore thing.
That's all done as a practical element with the rocks being pushed out and the snow falling. Of course, the characters are matted in. And then the background's a real snowy mountain background that was shot down in South Island. Of course, since everything's being shot at 120 frames a second, when you do a slow pullback, it's actually a fast pullback because the camera's slowing it down so much.
And ultimately, I think there's only 2 actual snow reaction shots that remain in this cut. The fact that you can barely tell which is a testimonial to everybody involved. But here, I think that's real snow.
That's a real one.
And that, even you don't know who it is, it's Viggo's hand. But it's sort of like, oops, that's all the real snow we've got.
The real trick in the Pass Garadra stuff was getting the performance of the snow to work right so that it would be sticky when it had to be sticky and powdery when it had to be powdery. So that was a clever mix of various things, salt and bicarbonate of soda and glass microspheres and various things mixed together with a very precise amount of moisture in it so that when it fell, it would behave the way real snow would behave. And so when it hit a surface, it would stick to it the way real snow would do.
The dwarves delved too.
This Saruman stuff kind of evolved as we went along because the original conception in the scripts didn't make it as clear as it could be that Saruman was essentially trying to manipulate the Fellowship to kill Gandalf, essentially, to kill his rival, and thus leave the Fellowship exposed. And we were able to make it clear that Saruman is essentially, manipulating them and pushing them and driving them where he wants them to go.
This will be the death of the hobbits!
For the DVD, we put a little bit extra back in here about Boromir being concerned for the hobbits. And interestingly, the shot of Pippin and Merry was shot up in the snow, and they look cold because they are really cold. The other shots were in the studio, but there's about 3 shots in there that are shot in the snow, and they really are shivering. And you can tell they look slightly bluer than the other shots of the Fellowship. Boromir, he says he's concerned for the hobbits, but we worry that he's got an ulterior motive, that the reality is he wants to go via Gondor, where his men can take control of the ring. So I'm not sure whether he's actually concerned for the hobbits or if he's trying to just direct the Fellowship elsewhere. Here we get a sense of Gandalf's fear of Moria, which is duplicated in the snow, really, when we intercut with Saruman trying to direct them into Moria. Here we get more of a sense of Gandalf's fear.
What do you mean?
But in the end, I don't think it was really necessary. So, and there, it's also the information that someone from the Fellowship will take the ring. We had it in half a dozen places earlier on in the movie, and we reduced it in the end because we felt we were signalling it too much.
We had to do an establishing shot of the outside of Moria and the Moria Lake. So basically we train up into a shot looking over the lake towards where the Moria Gate's going to be. So we had to work out something where we would establish the fact that we're in a new place, but that the Fellowship is in it. So they've gone suddenly from where they were in snow, and now suddenly they're in a whole new rocky environment. So we did this a lot, where we had to do transitional pieces that quickly give you registration if you're in a new location.
This scene was a scene we spent a lot of time cutting in the end. Peter shot a lot of footage and was about a 6-minute scene, I think, for quite a while. And there was a lot of little bits and pieces, a lot of little interplay between the guys. There was quite a bit of comedy too, from Merry and Pippin. Eventually we just felt it took far too much time to find their way into the door, and we just elbowed a bit of it.
And enter.
What do you suppose that?
We did the lake itself with Mylar, so we have a reflection of the rock wall in the surface, and then there's a little bit of digital water added on top of that.
The Athilde on the door, I got a kick out of it because it was essentially that same material that you lay on the side of roads. It's sort of that reflective material.
There's a 3M product. It's based on little shiny beads that are in roadside signs. And when light hits it, it actually sends the light back. It's called a lenticular bead, so that the light refracts right back into the source. So you light it from around the camera lens, and the light comes right back at the camera lens.
This is also one of those great moments where you sort of see Pete's appreciation of the flavour of Alan Lee's artwork, because this scene is almost exactly the still of the illustration out of the Lord of the Rings book illustrated by Alan, which again was done how many years? 4-5 years prior to his involvement in the film. But again, it looks like that painting, the whole palette, everything. It's great.
Yeah, it's sort of like probably two key moments in the movie, like the reveal of Dwergdelf. It's sort of another page of Alan Lee's illustration book, isn't it?
Yep. I mean, the design of the architecture slightly changed, but yeah, the whole feel, the whole palette and everything is very, very similar.
Don't worry, Sam. He knows the way home.
Yeah, so the lake outside the Moria Gate, one of those great environments, we had to get some really nice ambiences in there. And Tim Nielsen came up with some great elements through here. Again, it's one of the spooky places in the film.
Yeah, this is actually a set we filmed out in the outskirts of Wellington in a place called Wingate. And we built that wet pool. It was probably about calf deep, I think, something like that, maybe knee deep. And right beyond that wall is a road. We found this empty parking lot that we could rent, and we built a dam around the parking lot, and then took polyethylene to make sure it was leak-proof, and laid it down, seamed it, and filled it with water. And we used it for another sequence as well, for a movie 2 sequence, and it actually had a very deep part to it as well.
This shot is actually John Rhys Davies' double, not scale double, but real double, because he had terrible skin reactions to the Gimli face makeup, and he needed to sort of do 1 day on, like X days off. And because this was a pickup shoot, he didn't have enough of a turnaround rest day. So we actually had to find someone who's exactly the same size as John Rhys Davies and put the prosthetics onto him. And John Rhys Davies was actually out of camera frame, reciting the lines aloud as his double was mouthing the lines. Not all of them, just the one I spoke of.
The Watcher fight itself is one of those cases where effects-wise it's so dense and so well covered, but most of that you'll never hear because we ended up weeding most of it out to let it play with music. The version that you hear now in the final film is really quite sparse and stripped down to really the most essential kind of effects elements.
Like all the creature work in this film, there's a big, big, deep bow from the waist to the work of Ray Harryhausen, because Peter and I both idolize him and his work and the quality of his work and the feelings engendered in us by his animation, his scene design, his character design, not only when we were kids, but even today.
So the Watchers sequence is interesting in that when we first saw the plates, it was basically a guy with a mop splashing around in the water, and Aragorn and Boromir just kind of splashing around in this big tank. So the camera department, Brian Van Tull, had to go and track all this stuff on water plates, which basically has nothing to track to. Luckily, they stuck some pipes sticking out of the water with little red dots so they get some sort of match and line up to the thing. And I'll tell you, that camera department is incredible. They just could track anything and track it perfectly.
They're really among the unsung heroes in the production because
they
they
single-handedly put all this stuff together. So we started putting the Watcher in there once we got it all animated and rendered, and it was still looking kind of flat, even though they had these splashes. So what we ended up doing was sticking random imaginary splashes just flying in from off camera. And when you look at it, there will be a splash that comes from behind camera where there's nothing even splashing. But what happens is it instantly kind of gave you that excitement buildup that you were missing without it. And so it was that little bit of extra splash elements that was needed, and that instantly kind of sold the whole thing.
And poor Sean and Vigo were out there, and that was not a heated tank. That was near freezing water.
It's a 4-day journey to the other side. Let us hope that
We called this shot the New Chamber. Blue screen characters were pulling out from them and through this amazingly complicated miniature set where we had to close the set in around the camera as it pulled back. So we had the feeling that we were just really dodging these rocks as we went along. And the whole idea of this was to establish the fact that this place is huge and that the dwarves had worked it for thousands and thousands of years. All by hand. I love this shot. This is a full-size foreground with a miniature background. I'm glad that got back in. That was a fun one to do. Because basically we said, well, let's see how much of a set we can build back behind this thing. And so it just goes back and back and back.
The look for Moria is very distinctive because it is very monochromatic. What we did is we basically made a decision that because we were entering a civilization that was dead, we would visually interpret that as saying that we are sucking the life out of the colour palette of the film, which we did digitally. So when they first go into the mines, we still have the full colour palette, but what we did is we desaturated the colour very heavily so that a lot of the art direction, which is already fairly monochromatic, would virtually go completely black and white. And in many images, the only thing that was left was either we just had a very subtle green cast in some of the shadows, and the flesh tones were very weak, but they were still there, and the flaming torch were actually the only things that were providing any colour reference at all.
These stair shots, the miniatures were shot first, and then later when they shot the live action, and then when they cut it all together and realized where the characters needed to be on the stairs based on that, we did a blue screen shoot. We actually had to build as large a piece of the full-scale blue stairs as we could, and then using a combination of scale doubles and children and real actors, shoot the characters going up them.
This is a good example of cinematic dark because obviously there's really not supposed to be any light in here. How do you light something that's supposed to be in the darkness and still see anything? So basically you have to have some kind of a source. So we said, well, we're going to make it look as though it's far, far away, just the least little bit of light just seeping in. That means you just play everything in silhouette, basically. Everything's in either silhouette or edge light. There's no front light on anything.
We learn a bit more about Gollum in this little interchange that we put back in for the DVD. Something about Smeagol, and it's really information for film 2. Quite a few of the pieces we put back in inform film 2, so that people who buy the DVD will be better prepared for film 2 than people who have just seen film 1.
This was one of the tougher CG shots, only that this character had to be scrutinized very closely. It was one of the few shots I got to animate in the film personally. Animation through shading, lighting, everything.
Steve Demers and Darren Bedwell did the shaders and the textures on this and did a great job. We kept going for the eyes, and when you look at the eyes on this thing, it's just, they're incredible. I mean, they just have exactly what you expect to see.
And you couldn't get that retinal reflection from a puppet, or you couldn't, or a real thing, or it's just, it really, one of the things that CG does beautifully, which is, mimic.
And what we have to do beautifully for film too, where Gollum appears everywhere.
Constant.
So yeah.
Music inside of Moria is unique just to the sounds of Moria, singing all in Dwarvish. And the composition is completely unique to Moria. The only elements that you hear from the rest of the film are certain scenes that have to do with relationships with Frodo and Gandalf, where they sit and Frodo's quite uncertain about taking the ring, and he looks for Gandalf for wisdom. And you hear elements of Hobbit, Frodo's theme, not the hymn right there, but you hear a version of Shire music as he wonders about the wisdom of the task that he's on and whether he's even capable of doing it. By using Quenya and Sindarin and Dwarvish in Moria particularly helped me in the accuracy of the cultures, because you wanted to feel that you were in those worlds, not that you were observing them, but you were actually in them. So in Moria, Peter would say, when they look down into the depths of Moria, you want to hear all the lost souls that have been lost in those mines, thousands of dwarves. It's an all-male choir, because the dwarves were primarily a male race. Tolkien said that the female dwarves looked like the male dwarves, like they were hard to tell them apart. It'd be the only place in the film where you'll hear all male singers. So, I mean, all of those little details kind of helped create the worlds that the Fellowship would go to.
This is the introduction to Dwarelf Chamber, which was completely computer generated just because of the massiveness that we needed to achieve in this and the different flying cameras through these columns. It would be difficult to shoot miniatures and have the camera kind of fly at these levels through as being chased by all these orcs. Gandalf and the group was shot against blue screen. But then when we get into the chamber and we get to the wide shots, everything is digital, including the Fellowship. So we had to cross the bounds of making just a digital miniature. We had to match the detail that they were putting into the miniatures and the live action set. We actually had Andrew Lesney, the cinematographer, helping us with the lighting, and we were discussing with him, how would you light this thing if you actually had all the lights in the world to stick in this chamber. And so it was very helpful in getting that lit, and the idea was to get it to blend into the live action, which I think it did very well.
I wrote a theme for Dwareldelf, the ancient dwarf ruined city of Moria. I played that for Peter and Fran, and they liked that. It seemed to work well with that scene, and we watched it with the scene, and they heard this Dwareldelf theme. And it was this very sort of majestic, it had a kind of a ruined quality. When Gimli approaches Balin's tomb, when he sees Balin's tomb and he runs to it, you hear a little fragment of that theme.
When we get to Balin's tomb, we do a shift into the blue part of the spectrum, and that's partly based on the fact that there is one shaft of light that cuts from the outside down through the mountain and enters the window and lands perfectly on Balin's tomb, which was influenced by artwork. But, you know, I really loved it so much. It's almost like it's that sort of scenario where the light is hitting one part of a wall and the rest of the room is lit by the bounce off just that one thing.
The Balin's tomb set existed originally as blueprints, of course, but then as a three-dimensional computer model. This enabled us to approach the previs of this sequence rather elaborately, in that we went on a location scout in the computer before the set had ever been built and walked the set with the computer camera, finding angles and what have you. Those angles then would suggest action to us, and Peter and I sort of designed the scene.
The Mines of Moria was recorded by the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra, and it worked so well, I thought, because the chorus is an all-male chorus, and it's a Maori Samoan chorus singing in Dwarvish. And because it's all male, it was a great chorus to derive from that culture, because inherent in that culture is the haka. I don't know if you know that. It's a kind of a very aggressive kind of war chanting kind of a thing. And it worked so perfectly in Moria, because it is the action centerpiece of Fellowship. And that sound was just a wonderfully aggressive, wonderful sound. I kind of used it for both Moria and for the Balrog, figuring the Balrog came out of Moria, out of the mines. And Peter said, when you see the Balrog, it's the voices of hell.
Moria is again another one of these unique locations, and you don't have much in the way of any sort of external noise sources. You've just got winds and creating the space in the mix by the use of reverbs on Foley and on the dialogue.
We did a lot of recording in natural spaces to get the sort of natural reverb sounds here. We recorded in the Wrights Hill World War II tunnels outside of Wellington, and also in the big stone warehouse. We had the whole sound crew down there decked out in special props we had made so we could do movement for orcs.
And I also love the use of sound here, where it gets deadly quiet, and the only time you really hear that torch burning is when everything else goes silent, and I think it's a very effective use of sound.
Creating the sound of the orcs actually calling was one of the first things that we tried out, was using possum screeches, which is something PJ mentioned to us right from the beginning. And so Mike and Dave and a couple other guys took a trip up to the possum, what is it, a possum
Research Center.
Possum Research Center, about an hour outside of Wellington, and recorded various possums, and that became one of the main elements for the screeching Moray orcs.
All of the actual books, when they are describing the armour that the orcs and Uruks have, they're always talking about the metal shod feet. And so we had in fact 20 pairs of these stainless steel foot plates made up with these small metal lugs on the side. We could actually fasten them under sort of boots and shoes. They're not very comfortable, but you can actually walk around and run around and do various moves. So we had a whole bunch of people with these foot plates as well as other bits of metal scurrying and running around.
We cut this whole sequence with all the original design sounds of possums and whatnot, and then we took them into the Wright Hill tunnels and re-recorded them there in the sort of naturally reverb space from different distances and distant angles.
Balin's Tomb was one of the first sequences with a digital creature that we really had to get finished much quicker than any of the other sequences. It was one that was going to be shown at Cannes to help sell the film. It's such an amazing sequence. A lot of it, from a camera standpoint, is because of all the handheld camera work. It keeps it really alive, gives you a lot of that sort of feeling of combat action footage, documentary footage, you know. All these low angles looking up, they were all looking up into the lighting grid. So besides tracking all these shots to put the digital character in, we had to track bits of the architecture as well in order to cover up and put digital ceiling pieces and bits of architectural extension in there to cover all that up.
We previs this sequence on a motion capture stage. I dressed up in the motion capture suit and acted out the troll, about a 3-minute choreography of the whole scene. Then we synchronized different actors coming in, motion captured, fighting the troll in little moments. And then we keyframed a few more moments of actors interacting with the troll. Then we put them all together and made that a viewable scene that you could view through virtual reality goggles, which were hooked up to a virtual camera. So you could actually go in, be part of the scene, be a cameraman in that scene, running out of the way of the troll as he was fighting.
I think our fight choreography team always did a great job, not only a lot of the fights, but just coming up with ways of making Legolas's fighting interesting, because, you know, he's got a bow and an arrow, and that could get kind of boring pretty quick. And the way he uses some of the knives he's got on strapped to his back, and even the bow itself, and Peter's ideas of throwing in multiple arrows when he's firing off bows, that was something Pete came up with. I think all that's really kind of helped keep things exciting.
David Farmer did a really amazing job with getting emotion into the cave troll's vocals, which is something Peter was very keen to have happen, so that we could get some sort of character. The fact that this cave troll's not too bright. It walks in and it's really angry. And then it gets a bit hurt, and these things sting, and so it's got little sort of yelps of pain. Then it's getting frustrated when it's trying to find Frodo. So Dave had to come up with this huge range of emotions for the cave troll.
Since you're a hobbit looking up at the troll and seeing into the ceiling, that's all placed. The set was between 10 to 20 feet tall. Everything else was digitally replaced. And the one thing to look at through this entire sequence is I think the only time they had a locked off camera was when they were on an actor. Otherwise, it's just constantly moving around, and kudos to the camera department. I have no idea how they track this stuff, but it's incredible the way they line this all up. And it has to be tracked not only for doing the set extensions, but also for getting the character to fit in when animation is animating this thing. They're animating it to this moving camera.
An interesting sort of case in how the picture and the sound fed off of each other, because Peter's idea was that as Dave was developing the sounds for the cave troll, those sounds would get sent to the animators so that they would have something to work off of. So essentially this feedback loop between the sound and the picture was created where they could co-evolve basically. Some of the main elements that Dave used were a walrus and a horse and a tiger.
Hobbits, Merry and Pippin, on seeing Frodo, which they think is being killed. This amazing courage, and there's such a little character compared to this enormous cave troll, jump on top of the cave troll, and they're sticking their daggers to his head, trying to bring him down. And Fran said, play a fragment of the theme of Dwarrowdelf, the ancient ruined city. Frodo's dying. Very sort of majestic but it had a kind of a ruined quality. It was majestic and historical, but it was like that things had somehow gone wrong, and this world was decaying.
If that was a fight that took place in an environment with a very strong single source window light that was directly coming in and hitting the troll, it would be throwing a big shadow of the troll across the room. So that shadow would then be impacting on characters that are interacting with the troll. So then you would either be committing the digital lighting guys to having to shade everybody that is in the path of the shadow, or you would be trying to physically recreate that shadow on the set. What I did is I alleviated that problem a little bit, because what I had was I lit Balin's tomb with a soft ambient top light so that it's still a modelling light, but everyone is shaped from straight up above. And that light didn't actually interrupt with the principal concept that you still have a shaft coming through the hole in the wall and hitting the tomb and then bouncing back. But when you look around the room, basically everything else has got a very low ambient exposure, and that is coming directly from the roof.
Full of surprises, Master Baggins.
The Fellowship Escape out in Dwardelf, which was a full digital environment. The big, huge wide shots, or even larger shots where we see them all running across frame and we see deep down into Dwardelf, those were digital set extensions that had to be tracked in, and the camera duplicated inside the computer in order for all the columns to line up correctly and all the perspective to be right.
And the reason why we used digital doubles instead of blue screen is just because we had such wild camera moves, and to shoot these blue screen doubles would have required a stage the size of Cincinnati. This is a combination of blue screen foreground orcs, and then we duplicate them with massive in the back. The Fellowship and all the Dwardoff shots, as in other parts in the film, are completely computer generated. So we basically took scans of Ian and Elijah and then all the rest of the guys, literally built them in the computer, including the complete action set, their clothes, their packs they're wearing, their arrows. We had to make their hair and clothes react. If they had flowing capes, so you needed to get all the dynamics of that going.
Another technique we used a lot is called crowd duplication, where you get the same set of extras, you shoot them in one place, you mix their costumes around a little bit, you push them over to another piece of frame, and you shoot that, and you just keep pushing them around, mixing and matching them around. Then when you composite it all together, it looks like you had a much larger group of people there on the day than you actually had.
It's also one of the challenges in this film is that all the orcs are all different. There's all these various sort of races of orc. And so Moria orcs, visually for instance, they look sort of different from, say, Mordor orcs or Isengard orcs. They're smaller, more kind of bird-like, I suppose, almost.
Or crab-like.
Crab-like, yeah. They're kind of like these big insects.
For some of the initial tests we did for their sounds of movements, I actually took the sound of grasshoppers and different types of insects moving and played with those sounds, slowing them down. And those became some of the initial sort of movement elements that we then expanded on with having the crew in these different props. We ended up, for the scene where the crab-like orcs are crawling across the ceiling and down the columns, we did a lot of stuff with movement in the tunnels using shells we collected from the beach and scraping them against the walls of the tunnels to try and sort of imitate these crab-like movements.
Yeah, it's pretty much the kind of thing we were after, was to get the feeling that there's about 10,000 human-sized cockroaches in armour scuttling around the place.
Pete wanted all these huge sweeping moves, and Alex did a great job in realizing a lot of it. We then had to take these empty plates and put the Fellowship on there. In some cases, they ended up being digital characters. In other cases, we actually built a full-scale set of blue stairs. Not every stair that you see, but a small section of it that we could recycle for different pieces of the stair, and had to shoot blue screen motion control passes based on the miniature plate in order to get those real actors in there.
This miniature set, which is built at 14th scale, was still about 7.5 meters tall, about 20-some feet tall. And then, of course, because we could never build it as big as it really is supposed to be in real life, it always had to be digitally extended down into the depths. So all this, the fiery part down below the staircase, that's all a digital painting. But although the fire elements themselves are real fire elements, they're tracked in.
This shot here where Legolas fires the arrow and nails the guy right between the eyes, We had to shoot, and it was essentially getting a camera going as fast as possible on a long track about 80 feet long towards a stunty who was bravely standing there. And we had a rope, a bungee rope attached to the camera, well, that was on a dolly mount, just to make sure that it didn't hit him. And we had to do a few tests because, of course, it'd be a little bit of spring in the rope and a little bit of extra give that I was worried would end up hitting the guy right in the face.
Pretty much every shot has a miniature shot. The only real physical set that existed here was a little section of staircase, about a dozen steps. Everything else, even like this here that these guys are on, that's the miniature staircase that they're climbing onto. The staircase is only about 4 inches wide, so we're in many cases shooting this very, very tiny set at extreme magnification. There's a great tribute to the model builders who detailed this stuff. Every little speck of gravel and every little crack is detailed.
The simple animation took weeks to do just to get that right feel of weight, and the Fellowship's digital, the plinth falling is digital. The little staircase that they're walking on is a miniature, and then had to do environments to continue the infinite bottom.
House of Doom is basically built around the Fellowship theme. There's the struggle of the battle going on, and then the final leap across the stairs, and then as Frodo's thrown over by Strider and they're all on the other side, you hear the Fellowship theme. It's the very last time I think you hear that really heroic version of the theme, because it's the most glorious moment, really, for the Fellowship.
The pieces that are actually falling and collapsing are all digital, so that whenever you see kind of the static stairwell, that's the miniature piece. You'll notice that at the end there's one of the plinths falls, crashes against the wall, and continues down. That was all digital.
We now went into a more molten environment, so then we start to permeate the caverns with more red, which is also embellishing the fact that the adrenaline of the situation has picked up rather enormously. And by the time we get to the bridge, where Gandalf squares off against the Balrog, just filming his close-ups involved a massive arsenal of lighting gear, which I have to say we were looking at 10 to 20 meters square of lights, towers and everything, and it was like a huge disco. That's how I described it.
This bridge shot here is all completely digital. We started with a miniature, but because we had to change the move, we had to basically kind of encode everything into the computer. We took miniature set pieces and mapped them onto digital elements so that we could do the whole thing. And the Fellowship was digital and everything.
All motion captured.
All motion captured.
All 9 individually captured, and each one of those in 4 goes, yeah.
Some of these live elements of Gandalf, again, are that technique we call pin blocking, where if there's not a lot of perspective shift in the camera move, we could actually shoot him locked off and then shrink him down and pin him onto the place in the miniature he needs to be.
The Balrog, another member of the Harryhausen family, was a huge challenge. He's got to be more supernatural than just a big, dumb monster, so we give him a sense of, regality in his movements. He has to be both a monster, but also a malevolent, intelligent spirit who had to be animated in such a way as to allow the fire that would be applied to him later to behave in a way that was dramatically interesting. We didn't get the fire put on the Balrog till long after he was animated because of the fact that it was difficult to put fire to him, so we had to do a lot of best guess presuppositions in the animation, but usually they seem to pan out okay.
So now when it came time to break the bridge, once again, gravity is our enemy, we had to build that at quarter scale because we had to have the rocks fall in the correct speed and the correct sequence, because Peter had a very specific group of things that he wanted to have happen. So of course it was all pre-broken and then pinned back together, so when you pull the pins out, the rocks would fall out in sequence. But in order to make it work, it had to be built at a much larger scale. So this is a 14 scale miniature with a quarter scale bridge in the foreground.
Another technique called face replacement, where you'll shoot one actor and then put the face of a different actor on his body. In this case, when Boromir carries Frodo up the stairs, he's actually carrying one of the scale doubles. And then we track the scale double's head and shoot Elijah separately and have Elijah watch the videotape of the previous performance and try to synchronize to it. And then we're able to take his head off his body and put it on the other actor.
Gandalf falls, and you hear not Gandalf's lament, that you hear a Gandalf's lament in Lothlorien, but you hear a version of that, not as an exotic version. It's not quite Lothlorien, but you hear a beautiful plaintive piece that's very unique, really, just to Gandalf falling. and dying. I don't think you hear that music anywhere else in the film. Mabel Fatalu, wonderful South Island, New Zealand singer, who sang the solo of Gandalf dying.
The decision not to play any of their voices in this scene really heightens the emotion. Just letting it be all about the music playing their emotion.
And then it's so effective the way we actually bring it out on the sword wipe. That's when we're back into the business at hand.
It seems appropriate that it would be with Aragorn sort of bringing us back to reality and pulling it all together.
And this sequence is filmed at Mount Owen. It's sort of in the center of the South Island, not knowing that whichever way a storm is coming, if it's coming to New Zealand, that storm is definitely going to hit Mount Owen. So we sat on the ground for a week trying to get up to Mount Owen to do this sequence. It's pretty interesting because it's all this kind of white rock. It's a marble mountain, basically. And it's one of those locations, helicopter access only.
And Michael Samanek, the dialogue mixer, did a beautiful thing there with that Aragorn line calling out to Frodo where he echoes it off all the mountains and hills in the background. It's such a subtle thing, but just a beautiful touch that really puts you in that environment.
Now, at one point in the storyline, we did shoot a scene here that was worked out where you get the Fellowship starting to crumble a bit, starting to sort of argue, is this the right thing to do or not? Should we really be going through the woods? Which direction should we be taking? But that didn't end up making the final cut, but that was something that had been shot and sort of worked through a bit.
Originally, the scene where the Fellowship flee into the woods of Lothlorien, they were actually being chased by a whole lot of Moria orcs. They're hurrying through the woods and the orcs are catching up on them, and suddenly there's this volley of arrows from out of the depths of the forest that take down all the orcs.
That forest never ended up quite as I was hoping it would. I mean, it still works okay, but the sequence itself didn't 100% convey the mood that I was hoping it would. And to a certain extent, I did actually achieve that in the principal photography. When all the elements came together, it was a situation where I had to jockey the look to maintain the continuity.
This was conceived because Peter and Fran felt strongly that Galadriel might not be adequately set up, considering how such a significant character that she is. We sort of came across her in the cut where this scene didn't exist, and she sort of just came upon everyone, and she looked so regal and powerful, but you didn't really have much of a context. And so this scene was designed to provide context and a bridge from entering the forest into the Lothlorien proper.
Interestingly enough, I wouldn't lightly recommend to anybody to undertake the challenge of making 3 films at once, but one of the blessings of making 3 films at once is we actually had a cut of this movie in September while we were filming. Because we were filming 3 at once, we really did get on with cutting the film. We had a cut, we kind of could study the film, and we could sit on it for a while and let it form in our minds, and you could actually take advantage of the time that you had to actually improve the film as you went along. And even though we decided not to preview the film, we could gauge our own reaction, gauge the reaction we got from the studio, and actually greatly enhance the film by doing some pickup shots.
Now, once we get to Lothlorien, we're getting closer to the end of the movie, and we wanted to keep the pressure on the Fellowship. We didn't want the Fellowship to sit down and take a rest here, and it was a lot longer, this particular part of the movie, and it probably got cut harder than anywhere else, simply because it is later in the movie. You don't want to be introducing too many new characters, and you really want to get them into Lothlorien, get them on the road again. A lot of what Haldir says here, Galadriel says later on anyway. We get the idea that Frodo's brought this evil into Lothlorien. Probably see in the bowl in Lothlorien, we used a few of these shots to try and isolate Frodo from the Fellowship. See, he's isolated here, which is the point of this particular scene. We tried to communicate that in the bowl visions when he's with Galadriel in the glade. This was a nice scene with Boromir as he tries to console Frodo. It was a good moment for Boromir and a beautifully acted scene. There was a longer version again than this, where he told a story of himself getting over the death of one of his comrades. But that's an intermediate, abbreviated version.
There's a lot of actors in here. They're really good actors, but they're just so familiar faces in New Zealand television. You know, they've been in 1,000,001 commercials, or they've been on Shortland Street, which is New Zealand's primetime soap. And to the rest of the world, they're like, wow, okay, that's just Haldir or that's just Celeborn. But to New Zealanders, there's a lot of,
that's Dr. such and
yeah,
such.
exactly.
Or,
So all these really familiar faces.
We're into a set where we only had 8 trees total, but we had to build a whole forest. So basically every time you see the forest, you're seeing the 8 trees shot in several layers. We shoot 8 as the foreground, and then we move the camera back, shuffle them around, shoot them again, move the camera back again, shoot them again. So basically you're seeing 3 or 4 step and repeats of that same group of 8 trees. All of these structures were lined again with very fine nets and voiles and iridescent fabrics, so that you had the sense that you were seeing some very ethereal stuff inside the buildings. Not furniture, couldn't do that. It had to be just a sense of a sort of solid light. So the little tiny lights that were built into the sets were then reflected off these iridescent surfaces to create a sense of sort of layers and layers of strange glowing materials inside.
One of the things which Peter did when he filmed the elves, specifically Galadriel and Celeborn, was that he basically shot the pictures at 33 and sometimes even 48 frames a second, so that when it was playback normally, the images would have a very slow, dreamlike quality. Now, Peter liked the effect that having that dialogue slowed down and pitched back up had. Technically, it was a nightmare. What we did was we actually sped the pictures back up to normal speed, had the actor do the voice against the normal speed picture, and once we had the performance we liked, it was then edited and then stretched back out to fit the 33 or 48 frame picture.
Right, now coming up is a much longer version of the introduction scene where the Fellowship meets Galadriel. It's about 2 minutes longer than the one in the movie, the theatrical version. It's quite surprising actually that it's so much longer, but because it just seems to be a line here, a line there. But yeah, it's 2 minutes longer, and she goes through the Fellowship. She talks more directly to each member. It's a fuller, more complete version of the scene.
Lothlorien was quite successful. We set out to have a diffused, ethereal world of like a thinking world, a cerebral world. What I wanted to do was to have a cool world and also to move it into a slightly unreal realm, because I feel like it's a psychic world, and in fact, Galadriel is someone that can see into other people's minds and understand other people's feelings. So I didn't want it just a traditional colour for Lothlorien. I wanted to reflect, a slightly alternative universe. But at the same time, like everything in the film, we didn't want it to become too insane. So apart from the fact that we had the diffusion of the elvish world as that visual symbol again, what we did is we just moved the blues into, lavender. And we used lavender gels on set. And I also did some digital timing to move some of the blues that, hadn't quite got to exactly the right point into lavender as well. When you go for a colour like lavender, it's a very extremely fragile part of the colour spectrum, and in film technology, people don't go there a lot because any generation that you go through may lose it. I often hear people saying that you cannot get like the quality of jacaranda trees, captured on film, because it's got subtle lavenders in the flowers, and film just doesn't really understand some parts of the spectrum. And you're also weighing up that sometimes that colour can be a bit unflattering on skin tones. But I thought we were quite successful, and I thought we communicated that sort of world quite successfully.
It wasn't just one miniature. They actually shot the miniature passes because of the stage size. They had to shoot this in passes. So you would shoot, for instance, the foreground tree pass, and then you'd have to pull back to shoot the next layer back, because Peter wanted this kind of very infinite feeling as you were coming around these trees that you could see way off in the distance and feel as though you're not just on this little stage set, but you're actually seeing back into the trees. So we had lots of little miniature lights that all kind of moved and twinkled.
And again, the music here is great. Again, this is an Elvish piece written by Philippa, translated by David Salo, and then sung by Elizabeth Fraser. And it's a beautiful little piece of music. And it's the lament for Gandalf.
I wanted the score to have a feeling of a cast, and certain people were cast for certain scenes. Elizabeth Fraser has such a wonderful voice, and Fran suggested her, and I thought she would be a wonderful singer for Gandalf's Lament. Gandalf's Lament is a song that the elves sing, and you wanted that to feel as if that was being sung in Lothlorien. You wanted to feel that was real and that the elves were singing this piece. And it's in a two-part counterpoint, Gandalf's Lament. It's the choir. It's somewhat of a call and answer type of form. And then there was instrumental soloists of
It is long since we had any hope.
of the Ney flutes, the African flutes, and the Rieta, and there was an Indian instrument used called a sarangi, which was a solo instrument that was used in Lothlorien.
Noble man.
And I love this little sequence with Boromir because it gives the explanation of what's driving him and what his character is dealing with, I think in a very natural and very emotional way, very touching way. Well, what they've done is they've made him into a real three-dimensional character who has this arc, and he has these motives, and you can understand them. They actually ring true to you as you can identify with some of the things he's dealing with.
This was an absolutely gigantic set, and we did go through a fair amount of work on the art department, animatics, miniature models of this set. It was actually quite a large model that was on a very big table, and Pete and the art department spent a fair amount of time going there and recarving and adding tree trunks and offshoot roots to mask certain things, and deciding where he was going to work with his camera. He definitely put a fair amount of time into that before we started shooting, because it literally took the entire size of our largest stage.
So the shot where Galadriel and Frodo are kind of meeting at Galadriel's glade, basically Galadriel was shot on a set piece, and so what we needed to do here is at the beginning where Frodo's coming down, that's a miniature with a blue screen Frodo that then we use the tree point as the wipe, and now we're on to the set piece itself. And so we started on a miniature with Frodo, came onto the set piece, and now we're coming back up to Frodo coming onto the set piece again.
It was a huge set as it was, but unfortunately it was only the bottom part that could be fitted on the stage, and
Right.
so that expanded it further and seamlessly. I think just you wouldn't know looking at it.
Kate's wonderful. That's
Yeah.
about all I can say about Kate
Yeah, I mean,
Blanchett.
she was
really
here
liked her.
because of her shooting schedule. She was here relatively briefly, and actually it was a real challenge to schedule everything such that her work could be accomplished for all three films in a relatively condensed period of time.
I know I urged Peter, we had a double actually walking down the stairway for part of that with Frodo, and I did a reshoot of it because I thought you could see the double too clearly, and I'm quite glad that...
Yeah, you were right.
Yeah.
And some things.
There were a whole lot of different concepts for the mirror of Galadriel, and actually some of the shots that you see, suspicious glances from the Fellowship, are actually taken from the Lothlorien Flat. One of the sort of excerpts from there. It wasn't conceived differently, it was just a lot more involved. You saw a lot more, the storytelling was a lot more linear as to what actually happened, and now it is just played as these fleeting glimpses. And we came up with all sorts of fruity, elaborate ideas for how the transitions would happen, but at the end of the day, he's just looking almost like into a bowl of water and seeing the reflections, and therefore that's all it needed to be, was just cues of water rippling and the image dissolves.
You can see this was heavily graded digitally as well, this sequence. When we were filming Hobbiton, one of the very last things we did was burn down Hobbiton and designed it so that it could be burned down without being toxic.
Now the farm in Hamilton where Hobbiton was, is it's now completely a farm again? Is all the roads that we built and little doorways, that stuff all gone?
The farm still has the general contours of Hobbiton left. We actually filled in a swamp to build part of Hobbiton. So that remains. Our roads are still there, but of course the Hobbit holes are all taken out, and they're just mounds of earth there at the moment.
I know what it is you
The Galadriel as the Queen of Darkness concept when Frodo offers the ring. There are a multitude of concepts behind this. It's a moment that's very short in the book, that she sort of grows in stature and becomes this sort of this figure of menace. But as it's shown in the film, you know, her costume changes. Rather than just become like Sauron and become something of a thing of fire, she would become a slave to her own power. And since her ring is the ring of water, the colors were of a sort of a turbulent deep sea ocean, and
blue-green.
Yeah, there's scales on, you know, there's just these scales on her costume that sort of resemble, you know, sort of, you know, fish, I guess, and it was, you know, but not to be that literal, but those are the sort of the images that evokes, as well as, you know, a very menacing and demonic soundtrack.
And when the effects shots came in, I think the shots looked great, but there was just a lot of dialogue in terms of, is this kind of delivering what we wanted? The more that was thought through, it was decided that we had sort of made her look so dark and evil. We'd sort of taken away some of the, you know, the beautiful aspects to her face, and so that was kind of rejigged a bit there in the last minute to kind of soften and still let her beauty come forth. So it's not just this, you know. Because as Galadriel says, you know, that she'll be, you know, both dark and treacherous and beautiful like the sea. So having both of those concepts in there. I do like the concept that, you know, we see Galadriel, we get a glimpse of what she could be if she had control of the ring. And for me, that's great, not just because of, you know, what we get from Galadriel's character there and the fact that she passes that test, but also then for me, I think back to Gandalf and Gandalf's moment in Bag End and how he says, you know, don't tempt me, Frodo. And I think, wow, well, what would Gandalf have been like if he'd had the ring? You know, and that's kind of a nice thing for me as I'm watching the film that, you know, just, you know, it just sort of adds to, you know.
No, you're right. The also interesting is that if they're relative displays of someone's reaction if they're offered the ring, it just shows you how magical and fruity the elves are. That, you know, Gandalf just goes and freaks out and remains quite normal, whereas she undergoes this whole change. You're like, ooh, ouch.
Do you know how the orcs first came into being?
You should talk about how many hours Lawrence had to get all this prosthetic gear onto him.
Yeah, to create Lurtz, who was played by an actor named Lawrence McCory, in full prosthetic body. I think he started 12 o'clock noon the day before we were going to shoot, and he was on set around 9 in the next morning. That was 12 plus 9. It would have been around 21 hours of makeup. Unbelievable.
And he had to stand, obviously, for big chunks of it.
And then work a full day the next day. I think he was up something like 36 hours straight for that scene.
Saruman gives a pep talk to the Uruk-hai down in the caverns below Isengard, handing out the armor. And then here's some foreground Uruk-hai, some digital torches, and then Saruman, just a little tiny, just him and a little bit of a balcony, and everything else done as a miniature. And with a matching camera move. So it's a case of taking two little tiny bits of live action and then essentially building an environment to completely surround them and encompass them. We built the full set of Isengard, 60 feet across, outdoors, dug holes in the ground to be able to put the various pits into it. And we shot it a lot. We shot it for the moth shot. Here's a shot coming up where we're going to show the Uruk-hai charging up out of in battle formation, charging up out of one of the pits. This is all done as a motion control shot, of course, because those are massive orcs charging up the ramp. And then all the fires and the smokes and so forth, those are all put in, of course, after the fact also, because you can't do smoke in motion control speeds.
Now, the Fellowship leaving Lothlorien at the Silverlode, this was a much bigger scene originally, full of all sorts of pageantry and elf magic. But again, we wanted to get them on the road, so we toyed for a while with having the ore go in the water and then having a series of flashbacks. The lembas bread, by the way, is another thing for film too, that they carry the lembas bread, and no one would have known what it was. Here we see Sam's fear of water, which plays to the end actually quite nicely, his non-performance as a swimmer.
Seldom the orcs journey in the open under the sun, yet these have done so.
This isn't bad. This is additional pressure on the Fellowship. You are being tracked.
The handling of the elves, dare I say it, I think I've always found it more successful in the films than actually in the book. You always have this feeling that they're good and they're all kind of there and, oh, we'll help you out, but we won't help you out. Here, have a look at this, oh, we'll lend you a helping hand.
What's your address for those Tolkien fans?
It's Hawker Street. No, it's whereas here, Galadriel's advising, but they have this whole feeling that they have their own agenda, their own race to deal with, their own problems, and that they're departing the shores, and even though they want to help out, they feel very aloof. And Galadriel's a character that, it was so successfully portrayed that you are scared of her, or you never really lock onto her. You never understand her, or she feels very inhuman. And almost when they're leaving Lothlorien, it's almost a relief. They thought, whoa, we got out of this place. It was so surreal and so removed from the reality of the rest of the film.
Nice shiny daggers.
The gift-giving scene is pretty useful again for film too. These props are used: the bow, the daggers, elven rope. Frodo gets given the light of Erendil. They're all things which appear in movies 2 and 3, so while they weren't especially relevant, I was quite tough on this. I said, well, if we don't need it for film 1, we should leave it out, because we had so much pressure time-wise. Mike Horton, who's editing film 2, wasn't that sympathetic to this theory of mine, but this is a halfway measure of putting them with the DVD, so people who see the DVD will know where these things come from. That's one of the things they'll have to think about when they're cutting film 2. Whether they throw in flashbacks to show how they got these things, I don't know. There are always problems, and they're the problems that they have to solve. And this is another step in the Aragorn backstory. We learn a bit more about Arwen, and also about Aragorn being Isildur's heir and the shame that he's had to endure, and why he's so conflicted about the whole thing. So Galadriel, as Arwen's grandmother, I guess, is pretty keen for Aragorn to stay away. She'd rather have her granddaughter keep her immortality. It's a big responsibility for Aragorn, and he wears it. He takes things seriously.
Or to fall into darkness with all that is left.
The Elvish writing, the Dwarvish writing that's in the film come from several sources. We actually had 2 famous Tolkien conceptual artists, Alan Lee and John Howe, on the film, and they are very familiar with what Elvish runes are and Dwarvish runes are, and can write it themselves. In addition, we hired and worked with 3 Tolkien linguistic scholars who actually have studied, as linguistic scholars, they've studied Elvish and Dwarvish and Dark Speech of Mordor, and they were Dave Sallow and Bill Weldon and Tom Shippey.
Now, the one thing here about our Fellowship departing Lothlorien is that we've got that in our extended cut. You only see a few vestiges of the gift-giving. I still think the sequence works, in both scenarios. Because we still get the thought across that the elves really, were caring for our heroes and doing everything they could to help them along.
I have taken my worst wound at this parting.
But yeah, the completion of the Galadriel Gimli story is really cute, and they both played it really well. So that's an easy one to put back in, and it's such a memorable moment. It's such a big moment for Gimli that I would have felt really bad for him if it hadn't been in the DVD version.
Yes, you hear elements of the Fellowship theme on Anduin leaving Lothlorien. Yes, because the Fellowship is sort of regrouped. They've lost Gandalf, but the journey continues. And you hear somewhat of a mournful version of it. You never hear that true heroic version anymore after Gandalf falls. It's now disintegrating. The theme is breaking apart, and there's a lot of doubt. Frodo's somewhat mistrusting of the men. He's lost his spiritual leader in Gandalf. He's at a loss to what to do and who to take with him on the journey, or whether to go on himself. And there's a lot of indecision and mistrust at this point. So you hear the theme, but it's starting to come apart at the seams.
Just before the Fellowship comes into Amon Hen Sing Seat area, we were going to have a sequence where they go down these rapids, and
we're kind of ambushed by arrow wielding
orcs,
not orcs actually.
And it was quite a dramatic sequence, but we realized that we didn't need that actual beat at that moment in the story. It would be very time-consuming to shoot, so it was one of the very few cuts we made in our production plans.
The camp scene is really a continuation of the dialogue they had at Rivendell, but with more about Boromir trying to steer the Fellowship to Gondor. His need for the ring is really growing, and he's trying to persuade Aragorn to take the Fellowship via Gondor. But we learn more about Aragorn here in this exchange. So, in the DVD, we have really kind of underlined his story a lot better.
You haven't eaten anything all day, and you're not sleeping either. Don't think I haven't noticed.
This scene between Frodo and Sam was done as a pickup scene when we were trying to increase the sense of isolation of Frodo from the Fellowship. His inner conflict about having to set off on his own with the ring, his knowledge that he would only be able to do this mission on his own. So he's trying to shut Sam out, which Sam doesn't take too easily. And I'm sure it's difficult for Frodo too, but he thinks he's doing what's best by trying to build up the courage to go it on his own. A lot of the stuff which has gone back in the DVD is a lot of character stuff, a lot of if we called everyone apart from Frodo secondary characters, I guess, then they've all been fleshed out in the DVD. But Frodo was the emotional heart of the movie, of the Fellowship of the Ring. So and building his story up, others did lose out.
Scared of who you are, of what you are.
When the gates of the Argonath appear, this is an entirely new piece of music. But once through, the music changes to a theme that you've heard at the very beginning of the film, which was the History of the Ring theme. When you talk about the history of Middle-earth, you have to talk about Gondor. It's such an essential world to Middle-earth. The theme for Amon Hen was actually created first, and the theme was written for Frodo's journey away from the Fellowship. He's trying to make a decision about what to do, which leads him to the Seeing Stone. This was the great thing about the relationship of the writers, because when Peter heard the theme to Frodo in Amon Hen, he said, if you use that theme there, then you have to use the theme as Argonath, because it is part of the runes of Gondor.
Digital river and digital boats. I love this foot shot. This is so beautiful. The detailing is so good. Digital characters out the bottom, miniature set. As soon as we get to the top of the miniature set, we're going to go to a matte painting extension in the distance there. That's matte painted. Okay, still on the miniature. Some digital birds flying out of his eye socket. Behind him here is a live-action scenic plate with a little bit of digital stuff added in to blend it. So this shot's very complex in terms of assembly, and it pays off because in one shot it tells you everything. It shows you where you're going, it shows you where you've been, it shows you how big they are because you've seen the boats.
Basically, we always start with a scenic, which means basically going out into the New Zealand countryside and shooting a mountain or a plain or a river or some trees or whatever we want it to kind of start to look like. And what that does, it gives you this kind of cut and paste capabilities. You're basically creating the environment, because there is no place like Middle Earth. Contrary to what New Zealand says, that this is Middle Earth, a lot of it was put together at Weta Digital in these different layers. It obviously has beautiful scenery, and that's where we took it all from, because you are following this map of the real Middle Earth, and so you need a ground plane with a snowy mountain backdrop that you probably couldn't film anywhere, and so that all has to be comped together. We call it map paintings, but it becomes more of a painted into photo montage, I guess is a better way to explain it.
Another interesting thing about the way that was shot and the choice of shots in the Argonaut sequence is that Peter intentionally had this feeling that the camera was in a boat and it was rocking slightly. And when the visual effects guys got the sequence, they were picking all these takes that were rock steady, and Peter insisted that they take it out and go with the shot where the boat was actually rocking because he wanted that feeling of reality.
Something draws near.
And again, this is shot in different locations. The lake part of this is a place called Mavora Lakes, which is down near the area of Tiano on the South Island. And the Battle of Amenhen, which we're coming to, and right here is shot in Paradise, which is near Lake Wakatupu, near Queenstown. It's quite a spectacular beach forest that's overgrown with this moss and beautiful area. And Peter liked the idea, when I remember from the very first scout, of having ruins sort of incorporated and covered over with leaves and moss and so forth. And I remember scouting it with our swordmaster Bob Anderson, who was in his late 70s, and we often had to carry him up many of these hills.
So much depends on you. After doing so many of these shots where you have characters at different scales, it really became second nature for Peter just to pick logical angles and composing the real actors just correctly in depth so that they appeared to be the right scale. I mean, a lot of times you didn't have to do a fancy trick like blue screen or any separate motion control, anything. It's like you put one guy slightly further away, they act together, and one looks bigger and one looks smaller, or you shoot one at a lower angle looking up and one at a higher angle looking down, and once you cut it all together, your general impression is, yeah, there's a large character and there's a small character. But a lot of times it can be done just very simply and very effectively, just using traditional composition and selecting lenses and angles and stuff, as opposed to going to a lot of complicated visual effects.
That whole dialogue sequence, we were able to play, we did one wide shot, which is used, with a scale double, but this whole sequence is filmed with the two actors playing to each other, and we had a Steadicam, we had a 14mm lens, so we really expanded the distance between the two of them, and we choreographed it on that hill so that Elijah was always a little lower than Sean. We didn't throw any technical requirement on the actors at all. We just got them to block it out, and Pete was blocking it out with the cast, and I was walking around with a viewfinder and some lenses, and I was just having a look. But then I started, as it was going on, I started swapping to wider and wider lenses, and I was looking at sections of the master, so to speak, as I'm running through, and I was starting to think to myself, these guys look like they're the right scale, and it's because of the slope and this and that. So I sort of was going to Pete, I was going, Pete, I actually got a feeling we could do most of this scene in one shot as a master, these guys can actually play this scene out. They can play it to each other, and Sean can make a grab for Elijah, so it's like we can do this. And then he got it and started looking at it, and the bits that we currently couldn't do it on, he sort of said to the guys, because I think what hit him was, because at that point that I handed the viewfinder to him, we could do most of it, but there were one or two points that didn't work. Well, I think he suddenly really wanted to do all of it that way. So he said to the guys, guys, we've got a chance we could do this whole thing in one hit, and of course the actors were ecstatic. So what they did is they sort of jockeyed the bits that weren't working around until they did work. And then they were able to play the whole scene in one go. And that's sort of, that was really great.
We had to swish into Barad-dûr here, but we wanted to make this seeing seat different than anybody else's vision that anybody had ever thought of. How do you? It basically kind of works like a TV screen. You can kind of, wherever you look, you see something that's happening currently. And but how do you do those transitions? How do you get from one thing to the next? And how do you establish Barad-dûr in the distance and then quickly get into it. So we did a thing where we shot it with a very, very wide shutter, a 300-degree shutter, so as we zoom in towards it, everything streaks and smears. Because we wanted to have it didn't want to just look like what Peter called the boogie board shot. He didn't want it to look like we're just sliding the camera towards it. You want to have the feeling that you were actually transcending time and space in getting to it. So after a lot of experimenting, we figured, well, that would be the best way to do it. And then it, of course, it swooshes into it very rapidly, and then we swoosh up to the top. So it's actually the biggest camera move that we made.
For me, the seeing seat actually has an impact over the entire landscape. So from the moment they arrived, it was a slightly uneasy landscape. Legolas was already feeling the presence of the Uruks, even though, there was nothing substantial to base that on. And Elijah is now starting to suffer the feelings of paranoia and mistrust, which is sort of emanating amongst the Fellowship. So what you have is you have an environment which has got a slight unease. So when we went to film at Paradise, we knew immediately that we wanted to push it into a realm that would express those emotions.
I remember when we first started planning out this sequence, or actually when we were getting close to shooting it, we were in Queenstown, and Peter had never shot a big battle sequence before, so he called Andrew and I over to his house for dinner, and we kind of blocked out how we were going to stage the sequence and laid out the storyboards and figured out how to actually cover it. Of course, after the first day, Peter was well into the battle, and it went like clockwork, really. We were heading towards Christmas, and we wanted to finish the sequence by Christmas, so we figured out a way to do it.
When this stuff was shot, it was really hot, around 100 degrees plus kind of a thing, and you had these guys in Uruk-hai suits, foam rubber, very thick, wearing helmets, and they were just a wonderful group. I mean, they hung in there and they made it through. Got to obviously keep getting them watered and whatnot, but they really worked hard to get those fighting sequences in some pretty serious heat. And a lot of them ended up showing up later on when we were shooting Helm's Deep, and they were just a great core group of not only stunties but extras that did that work.
It was storyboarded a lot more flatly, a lot less interconnected, and just this whole drama and the developments of the script and just all this interplay of all the different groups and Pippin and Merry leading the Uruk-hai away sort of came together a lot later, but it's just it's such an amazing climax, more so than a lot of other areas of the film, sort of the Fellowship just completely willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for the greater goal,
Now, this whole fight was actually the only real ratings challenge, this reel in this fight.
Right, we cut down a lot of things
Yeah.
to get our rating
Yeah.
in the sequence. And one of the great things about working with Peter, one of the things that it was generated by the nature of the immensity and the epic quality of the film we made, was that while we were filming and often watching 5 hours of rushes or dailies a night, there were creative issues that we had to deal with. So at Peter's request, I put together what I call the think tank, which was some of the more creative department heads of the film, like Richard Taylor, Alan Lee, Paula Sane, the writers Philippa and Fran, and I'm sure I'm dropping out a few. And if we had issues to solve, rather than Peter having to go home after rushes to solve these issues, we could have the think tank present us with a bunch of different thoughts and different ideas. And even the very end of the movie, we started to evolve that way and wrestle with the way to get the drama in the ending of the film.
Yeah, this shot here, in the theatrical version, he shot 3 arrows, and we had a version, it was originally conceived as a 9-arrow shot, which, it takes forever, and I don't know. Peter thought it was a pretty cool gag, and I know he loves the shot. So we went to a 6-arrow kind of intermediate version for the DVD.
On this shot, we had this cable cam that Harry Harrison, who handled our MoCon rigs, also handled this, and I think he built it with a few others. And essentially, it was this long cable with a camera attached to it, and we used it in the battle sequences in this one shot, and we also used it a bit in the horse chase. But it was a pretty great setup. We also used it later on in some of the other films.
This business of the rock throwing, the Merry and Pippin throwing rocks at the Urks, when I saw the dailies, I was a bit concerned. I thought, these little tiny guys throwing rocks at these huge fighting machines, and to be honest, I felt that it didn't really work, so I was keen to leave it out, the theatrical version. But Peter always quite liked it, and he felt like Merry and Pippin had to play their part, and they had to fight back, do whatever they could do to help Boromir. So there's two sides to it. You know, I agree entirely that they would play their part, but I just couldn't see the rocks knocking over those big guys.
Death of Boromir, or the departure of Boromir, Peter did a wonderful thing with the sound and the music, where he takes the sound and he treats it in a way. He's taken the reality of the battle out and created almost an underworld to the action that you're seeing on screen. It's almost as if you've fallen underwater and you're hearing the sounds filtered through several feet of water. The analogy is Boromir is sinking. The arrows have gone in and he's slowly going down, and he knows he's finished. He's dying. And it is the feeling of submersion. You know you're just falling into this dark pit. The sound of the boy choir singing in Elvish, it had a quality of youth to it, of almost like a lost youth. When Boromir's dying, you hear those boys singing, and he looks at the hobbits because he knows he's finished. And you hear those boys singing. It's just such a wonderful sound. And I did it all based on the shot of Boromir's eyes as he looks at Merry and Pippin.
Now this is a good sound anecdote, because I remember when we were doing, I can't remember, I think it was one of the temp mixes, but it doesn't really matter which one. When we were mixing, the first mix that I heard of this sequence was at sort of full volume, and the death of Boromir, which is this unbelievably poetic, moving sequence, both here and in the theatrical version. The original mix of it, or contemplated mix, was at normal full battle volume. And I remember sitting on the mixing stage out in Lower Hutt, thinking to myself, as I'm sure as others did in the room, that it's such a brutal scene if you've got it at full volume. And I remember, I know I mentioned it, but a number of people did, that to try this kind of elegantly muted, sort of, it's all in this, what Boromir hears within his own ears might be a more moving way to go. And it was one of those things that Peter just said, well, let's try that. And the minute it was tried, it's one of those great moments where the whole room, it's like suddenly, that's it. I mean, everyone, every mixer, everybody in the room, Peter just knew immediately that that was the direction to go.
This whole fight with Aragorn and Lurtz, this is the type of work you always expect to do when you're on a Peter Jackson film, getting the decapitations, the arms being cut off.
Lurtz gets a hold of Aragorn's dagger and throws it at Aragorn, and it's actually an aluminum stunt dagger, but nonetheless still made of metal. And it was Viggo, I think it was Viggo that said, no, just throw it. And Lurtz threw it, and Viggo really hit it with that stunt sword. I'm kind of stunned that we even allowed that to happen.
Well, and I'll also tell you, the other thing is Lurtz threw that thing, and it stuck into a tree.
Oh, yeah.
And another attack, and actually buried fairly deeply into the tree. Because that was a shot without Aragorn there.
Yeah, of course.
In the case of this headshot, that was a digital sword blade. That was actually just the hilt and a few inches of the sword that Aragorn had on set with him. And he swung it so that it was short of Lurtz's head. We extended the blade to make it look like it was going right through Lurtz's head, and shot a separate puppeteered Lurtz head against blue screen. So at that moment when it gets cut and it falls off his body, we do a quick little morph and animate his head falling off and rolling onto the ground.
Now, this is actually a good little writer thing. This was actually not the original dialogue. It's the dialogue that was shot originally, but it was actually a far more expositional scene. Boromir saying, what am I going to do about my kingdom? And everyone, Sean Bean, Viggo, Fran, and Philippa all realized that a full-blooded three-dimensional character who's dying is not going to be spouting expositional dialogue for the benefit of the audience. He's going to be speaking much more from the heart. And so it was changed literally a day or two before it was to be shot, and obviously to huge benefit. That's actually illustrative of just the very tight collaborative nature throughout the production of the actors and the screenwriting throughout the film.
So when we previewed, we put together a temp mix, and Fran was drawn to Howard's music. So when it came time to actually get the composer involved, Howard was a very natural choice. He was such a great collaborator with Peter and Fran that I think the result is incredible. In many ways, as Howard's fond of saying, the score, which is over 2.5 hours long, and it's more like opera than it's like writing movie music.
Captain.
Then finally, as Boromir's eyes close and you know that he's gone, he's finished, you hear a processional, funereal version of the Fellowship theme. It really is the end of the Fellowship.
The more conventional instinct would be to just have the score swelling up, and it would clearly overwhelm the scene. And Howard's just so good that he knows the power of his music and the power of the lack of it.
The moments of silence were incredibly key and thought out very carefully. We called them pauses. They were breaks in the music where just a pure natural sound would come through. A very beautiful one is after Boromir dies, the Fellowship is splitting up, and you hear a very sort of funereal, processional version of the Fellowship, and then it ends, it stops. And you just hear water from the river lapping on the shore. You hear a little wind in the trees, and that silence is just so amazing. And then camera comes in on Frodo, and he has the ring in his hand, trying to decide what to do. That pure, beautiful sound is just going on with no music. And then you hear Gandalf's voice, and you start to hear a bit of the music starting to come in, and then it starts to get a little bigger as he makes his decision, and then he goes to the boat, and the music swells.
Elijah really just nails his performance. I mean, it's just so fantastic. And it's amazing to me, the camera's so close to him, just inches away, and yet he is just giving this fantastic performance, really getting you into the moment, and you're just so much there with him.
I wish the ring had never come to me.
When we conceived the ending of the film, it ended with Frodo and Sam rowing across the lake, and New Line felt that was too flat. So we came up with the idea that when you thought they had escaped and the boat was out in the middle of the lake, and Uruk-hai came up from under the boat, reached up and pulled Frodo out of the boat. And they went and they had this battle underwater, and Frodo was just about dying.
In the struggle, the ring slips off of Frodo's neck and somehow gets down in the water, and the Uruk, captivated by the ring, goes for it and is so obsessed with it that he actually drowns himself trying to get the ring, and Sam is able to whack the Uruk and somehow get Frodo out of the water. But it was and the ring as well, and it was definitely more of a plot-driven, conventional kind of like the villain pops out, Fatal Attraction, just when you think the villain is vanquished, the villain is still around, kind of an ending.
And we were never satisfied with that. And I remember we were wrestling with what the ending should really be, and we decided to give the think tank the task of coming up with some alternatives to that ending. And they came back with this really compelling thought that the movie wasn't about that. That moment wasn't about that. It was the parting of the Fellowship, and it was about loyalty and friendship, and the most dramatic ending would be much more true to the story, which is exactly what ended up being filmed. And they presented that idea, and we all said yes.
So it's really, rather than an Uruk, it's really Sam who nearly drowns and Frodo pulling out. And this is something but the real issue is what Barry says, is the idea that rather than have an Uruk drown in a sort of a plot-driven kind of desire to end the movie, to have something that's far more dramatically and emotionally charged, which is this sort of the breaking of the Fellowship and the near breaking of Frodo and Sam, but of course not.
We're filming the sequence, and we did all the normal things that you do when you're working around water. We checked the banks and made sure there was no obstructions in the water, and of course we go to film the scene, and Sean's running down to the boat, and all of a sudden he, as a trooper, goes through the scene, but he has stepped on a twig that's sticking up from the bottom, and it goes into his foot. And he went through the whole shot, cut the camera, then he grabbed onto the gunwale of the boat, nearly tipping it over. And we realized something was wrong, and they brought him to shore, and he had punctured this big hole in his foot. And we had to call in a helicopter to get him medevaced out. Boromir going over the waterfall. For the longest time, there was a pre-visualization of this shot in the cut. And it stayed there. And Peter never talked about shooting it, so I assumed it was going to be somehow a computer-generated shot. So I said, Peter, what are we going to do about that previous shot? He said, oh. So, and this is while they're scoring the movie in London. This was really late. So he said, I need you to shoot that shot. And so we went out into the bay. Of course, we didn't have Boromir. Richard Taylor built a prosthetic silicone face with a wig and his outfit, created that in a calm day on the sea, and I used some motorboats to create this wake and the kind of turbulence that you see, so it would cut into the sequence it was going into. And it was the last shot done for the film.
What makes it such a great transition is that you cut from this incredibly poetically tragic image of the Viking funeral of Boromir, and you cut to Aragorn, who's cinching up those leather gauntlets, and if you look, you'll notice that those are Boromir's gauntlets. And he's going to keep his promise to Boromir of taking the mantle of humanity.
This is actually one of Howard's best pieces of scoring. This whole finale is just pulled together so well by the music. They're resolved to each other. They're sort of just covering what's going on, but the music just has this sort of this uplifting sense of, I don't know, anticipation, I guess. You're just like, wow, it's music that's almost telling you something fantastic is about to happen, and then the film ends and you just want to keep on going, and you want to follow both the threads of the story and follow these friends that you've met.
I was getting a kick out of this shot of our hobbits looking off into Mordor, because it was actually shot on the side of Mount Ruapehu, and the view they had, it was a parking lot and a few ski huts and, you know, the crew, the crew trucks and whatnot. But Wes did a great job just sort of slapping in Mordor there in the distance.
We may yet, Mr. Frodo. We may.
You know, it's funny, you look at this scene now and how the movie ends, and it all, in retrospect, seems so brilliant. But it was really an unbelievably bold move to end the movie this way. It was bold on Peter and Fran and Philippa's part as sort of storytellers, and it was bold of the studio to actually embrace this ending. This is not just a cliffhanger, this is essentially a melancholy kind of ellipse.
I think a lot of people in the film industry are nomads, and they basically roam around searching for like a wonderful experience or wonderful people to work with. And every so often you strike wonderful people and a wonderful experience, something that's going to enrich your life. It was, something that you will learn something about other people and the world and yourself. And I think this is definitely one of them. Everyone was passionate about it. I think the hierarchy made people aware of the fact that every single person was respected for what they had to offer. So, and when people feel that they're being respected and appreciated for the work that they do, and that sometimes crews will slave their hearts out and their work was being appreciated, that's why everyone travelled so amazingly well on the project.
Bottom line, we've had a real blast on this track. Had the chance to sort of play with all sorts of recording experiments, like a great team, just, sort of working all towards this one fantastic end. And
it's also such a rare opportunity to be able to work on a project like this that's going to go on for 3 consecutive films. There's nothing pulling us away in between, so we're really immersed in this fantasy world for at least 3 years straight, continuous, and it really allows us to develop these themes and to build upon the work that we've done for the first film over the next 2. It's a rare opportunity.
And for anyone else out there who's thinking about making 3 films back to back, don't do it.
The satisfaction that we get in having worked on this is that, I think more than any other film I've done, our work is so beautifully embedded into the text and into the fabric of the story. You don't ever say, oh, look, there's a miniature shot. You just say, oh, that's cool. Gosh, did they build that? That's amazing. There's a tremendous satisfaction doing that. It's a tremendous satisfaction in making a pure storytelling story. And I think Peter's done a brilliant job of the way that he's written it and the way that he's put it together and the way that he's had the nerve to say, I can put a 15-minute miniature sequence on the screen and I can make it work. I can make it good enough and exciting enough so the audience will say, oh, wow, they built that? That's amazing. a tremendous treat to work on this. Of course, we're looking forward to doing the next two, which get even more exciting. You know, when I went into this, somebody said, "Oh, it's the Holy Grail," and I said, "Yeah, that's my line. I know it's the Holy Grail." When I was told that I might have the chance to work on it, I thought, of all the projects I've done over the last 30-odd years, this is the one that would be the one that has the most attraction for me and the most satisfaction in doing it. Everything I'd hoped for has certainly come to pass.
The biggest factor in the success of the whole thing is that since a lot of the people here were separated from the machine and the tradition of how things normally would be done, like in the States, they didn't have that experience, but they had a lot of fresh insight on how they thought things should be done and applied a lot of just ingenuity on how they thought things should be done. And in most cases, it worked really, really well. Instead of saying, oh, well, this is the type of thing that we did on 20 other shows over the last 30 years, and we always do it this way, and you always do it that way, and it's always tough to do. Sometimes it really takes somebody who's never been a part of that experience just to say, oh, well, that's the problem. Well, I think I'd solve it this way, and not to have a huge committee of people to resist and just say, oh, sure, okay, go for it. And say, yeah, okay, we did it, and wow, yeah, it totally worked. I think that was the major thing, that and just the people's passion here, just to say, you know, we really have to prove to everybody that we can do this, and it's such great material. You can very easily get into it. Such a cool environment. The stories are so well known and stuff, and you can talk to people about, yeah, I'm working on Lord of the Rings, and that they at least read the books and they know something about it. And I think that was really the major factor that really pulled the whole thing off.
I think I'm always writing from an emotional impact. I want to feel something when I watch the film, and that's how I create music. I mean, I'm watching the film and feeling something and trying to create that in music. And in a story like this, even though you're telling on a vast historical scale, this vast scale of this story, it still is about these people. And you want to relate to Frodo, and you want to relate to Bilbo, but you want to feel what they're feeling.
Often, if you're going to do a picture that has the size of our budget, you're forced really by economic considerations to cast celebrity as stars. Often that detracts from the film because they're so recognizable that instead of looking at the character, you're looking at the star. In a way, we were able, because the star or the thing that opened Lord of the Rings is the fact that these books are so beloved and they have such a wide fan base of over 100 million people worldwide have read these books, that you didn't have to rely on casting huge stars to open the movie, which means in layman's term, to draw an audience that would call attention to the movie, that you could actually rely on the source work to call attention to the movie. Instead of going after stars, and nothing wrong with stars, but we could actually go for the best and most appropriate person for the role. And we got the greatest actors in the world and such a group of really professional, talented people who are a real pleasure to work with.
The pursuit of excellence, of making the film as good as it could be, was just paramount. We were all exhausted by the end of it. And Peter and Fran were exhausted too. We were all totally shattered by it, but I think we all feel quite proud of it now.
I can't imagine these films being made any other way or by any other guy in any other place. I'm sure
it'd be almost physically impossible. I mean,
yeah.
Almost if you went back retrospectively, I mean, you probably shouldn't quote me, but it would almost look like on paper how not to make a movie. I don't know. It's one of those. There was no formula, It was just people just inventing on the fly how to get it done. Can't imagine you could go back and pre-plan actually how this stuff came together, because most of the time it didn't come together the way we were planning it. It just evolved.
And this was a picture, I think, where everyone involved, from Peter on down, had to be better than he'd ever been before. And I think most of us really, rose to that challenge.
Yeah, and this is a film where the paycheck was the secondary part. I mean, across the board, from the actors down to, the guys putting tapes in the tape robot, they had this commitment, this
real
unbelievable
passion,
commitment to Token, Peter, just everything. If any one of us didn't do our job, it would have just detracted from the entire rest of the film. It was just the synchronicity of everybody kind of being there at the right place at the right time and doing the best job that they possibly could, and that I think made it all come together and work,
It's hard to talk about this movie without talking in hyperbole, because making 3 movies that are not just 3 easy little movies, but 3 movies with a cast of over 22 people strong, where everything's manufactured, where we used over 40 actors in wigs, not including the extras, where so many people had prosthetics. It just became an incredible logistical nightmare to get through it all. It's a real tribute to the team we put together and that we're actually here today. And I just long for the day we deliver film 3 where we can actually enjoy the completion of all 3 films and take a very long time off.
Yeah.
This commentary has been about as long as our average screening of daily footage during the production. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for hanging in. Be sure to check out the other commentaries with Peter, Fran, Philippa, and with the design team. We'll be back again next year with The Two Towers.